Ichigo whirled underneath the blade. It sang sharp and heavy with a gust of wind that kicked dust into the air that in the too bright artificial sunlight almost looked like flecks of gold. Ichigo was tempted to cough, but was forced to adjust his grip on Zangetsu's hilt as Kisuke grinned at him, too bright and manic in a way that was almost suspiciously hollow-like, and brought his blade down in a quick arc. Zangetsu snapped up sure in his hands. It was easy, like thought wasn't even required, and all Ichigo could feel was the pounding of his heart thrumming through him, the stretch of his muscles, the sweat dripping down his spine and across his forehead. Everything else disappeared. There wasn't time to consider what could happen, what he was going to do. Kisuke didn't let him. Their blades clashed with a shriek of metal and sparks as Ichigo pushed against Kisuke and evened out his stance. It always was disparaging how Kisuke managed to hide how strong he was beneath his Hari and a disarming grin. He was almost unfairly strong. Granted, it was different from when Ichigo had been a kid barely able to reach his ribs, much less anywhere else, while trying to wield a blade that was meant for an adult. It just meant Ichigo knew how to work around it. Or at least he tried when a sudden growth spurt didn't throw off his balance and move him firmly into the realm of gangly limbs that shouldn't be where they were. Ichigo sprung back in a burst of flash step, moving in quick jolts and leaving a sharp afterimage that wouldn't confuse or probably distract Kisuke in the slightest, but it allowed Ichigo the satisfaction of knowing that Kisuke probably couldn't see him swngng his sword over his head. Or he could. Kisuke whipped around at the last moment and their blades caught, bright and shining like liquid fire, but too pale, and then Ichigo was forced to drop to the ground and bring his blade over his chest as Kisuke pushed the offensive. His breath whistled past his lips as Ichigo slipped to the side and responded with a jab. His fingers twitched and for a moment he was tempted. But then there was a shaka in his face and Ichigo was forced to pay attention as he deflected the kido off of Zangetsu's blade and felt the heat sear itself across his fast. He whipped around and jerked to the side, feeling slightly off balance as he slipped Zangetsu upwards from a low angle with a hope and a prayer as he adjusted his stance. Kisuke grinned, and Ichigo resisted the urge to frown because Benihime would lecture him again about giving away his thoughts, heart on his sleeve or something. Ichigo wasn't quite certain what the problem was with trying to understand one's enemies, but everyone else was kind of old and merciless, so they didn't really get it. Right, grinning, dangerous. Benihime moved quickly, like lightning striking forward and fast. Ichigo was forced to duck, Zangetsu sliding along his chest as he fended off Benihime's blade, and he dropped to his feet and kicked his leg out. Kisuke stepped over his leg and kicked his other leg out towards Ichigo's chest. Ichigo rose to his feet and grasped Kisuke's outstretched foot with one arm, using the motion to throw him over his shoulders. Kisuke rolled on his feet and whipped around at a speed that was near neck-breaking, and suddenly Benihime was in personal space once more. Fighting Kisuke was different from sparring with Kisuke. When they spared, it was all about teaching, trying to get Ichigo to use that move they had gone over 5 times in the last session, and maybe trying to use Kido without having it blow up in his face, and afterwards, Ichigo would heal any minor injuries and try to give Benihime a high five. But a fight was different. Kisuke wasn't playing, wasn't trying to soften his blows. If Ichigo was going to survive the fight, it would be because he had been trained well enough to do so, and that was it. They fought dirty and they fought strong. Benihime scored a gash across Ichigo's chest, cut through the thin material, and it burned, but not as much as Ichigo's thoughts blaring loudly about distractions, even as Zangetsu's chuckles reverberated through the back of his skull. If anyone else had done it, Zangetsu would probably have been compiling a list of different ways to bisect someone, but it was Kisuke and therefore okay. Zangetsu made a hissing noise, which could have been agreement or the fact that Ichigo had just rolled across the solid ground and into a nearby pillar. His breath struggled weakly out of his lungs like a train limping into a station, and Ichigo hung his head only for a second before his fingers tightened around Zangetsu's hilt, and with an inhale he rose to his feet. Reiatsu pulsed beneath his skin, hummed through his fingers alive and bottled up like a Coke bottle with a Mento on the lid just waiting to go off. It was almost enough to make him physically vibrate when he tucked his Reiatsu close to his skin. Instead, he shot forward. He could feel Kisuke somewhere nearby and could almost hear the Kido incantation being spoken. Focusing his Reiatsu, Ichigo whirled around a stone pillar with Zangetsu hovering at his side. Benihime clashed against Zangetsu with a heavy clang, and Ichigo dropped to his feet and forced his blade against Kisuke's, ignoring the burning in his arms and the way his chest was heaving. He wasn't quite sure how long they had been fighting, but that BLD from the wound on his thigh had already dried, and the small cut over Kisuke's brow had stopped bleeding but had left him looking kind of ghoulish. And then Kisuke was there, blonde hair like a halo around his head as he grinned, and Ichigo's lips twitched even as his chest burned and Zangetsu whirled in his hands and his feet shifted. It was almost like a dance, fighting with swords, like a Russian dance, but with swords, and the stakes were higher and the music was set by the dancers. Or something like that. Regardless, Ichigo could almost see the end of the dance in sight, and he tucked his Reiatsu closer to his body, wrapped around his hands, and through the blade, listened to Zangetsu's purr of contentment thrumming with anticipation. Kisuke was clearly following the same line of thought. His eyes were bright, and Ichigo could almost see Beniheim's satisfied smile at the thought of her wielder using his Shikai. She liked to complain about how lazy he was often. Ichigo adjusted his grip on Zangetsu and shot forward, dust and cracked earth roaring beneath his feet and Reiatsu crowing about his brain as Kisuke waited poised like a predator and 50 times more dangerous. A whistle broke through the silence, loud and piercing, and Ichigo grounded to a halt. His feet skidded in the dirt and Zangetsu slumped to rest against his side as he turned his head to survey the training area with a gusty sigh. His body was a conduit of Reiatsu, and Ichigo could feel it shaking through him like he could shed it in tiny raindrops as he breathed and tried to ease the tension in his chest before looking to Kisuke, who was looking at the ladder. Running a hand through his sweat-soaked hair with another sigh, Ichigo dematerialized Zangetsu. Something about that was probably problematic, and padded forward to see who or what Kisuke was staring at. It was Yoruichi. She had her hands planted on her hips and maybe looked angry, but it was a very similar look to her pleased expression from a distance. She shook her head, a spot of color against the dull training area, and stalked forward. "I called your names 5 times, you know?" She began with a raised brow, and Ichigo concluded that the ground was suddenly very welcoming as he nodded with a chaste expression and dropped to the strong stone. Kisuke rubbed a hand over the back of his head with an easy grin and a half-hearted excuse about concentration that only worked because Yoruichi wasn't really mad. She rolled her eyes and dropped down to sit beside Ichigo as he stripped off his shihakusho and poked gently at the cut spanning his torso. It probably wouldn't scar. Pulling at the sparking threads, like static, of his Reiatsu, Ichigo focused on getting his Reiatsu to comply with his cells and produce some skin, please and thank you. Kisuke and Yoruichi were doing the thing where they had an entire conversation without words, and if he was lucky a few twitches. Ichigo only ever knew what they were speaking about if Beniheim told him. She was frowning, curled behind her wielder with the same sad expression she wore on the anniversary, and it curled something in his gut and dragged him back into reality, one where Rukia was still in Soul Society and there wasn't going to be good news. The cut on his thigh suddenly felt sharper, and he was almost hyper-aware of his skin attempting to knit itself back together across his stomach. It was strange and disorienting, and Ichigo dully acknowledged that maybe that was the adrenaline drop making an appearance. Ichigo became aware that Yoruichi and Kisuke were staring when Zangetsu did that thing like a cat bristling and stretching after a long nap, and he glanced up only to be pinned by their gazes. "What was the verdict?" Ichigo questioned and rubbed one hand over his arms as he finished healing the wound on his stomach and prodded it carefully just to make sure everything was where it should be, and if it wasn't that would be problematic and probably a good threat. Kisuke turned and his hat had appeared. In the 3 minutes Ichigo had been focused on other things as he tipped it down over his eyes. Yoruichi frowned and Ichigo could tell she was a minute away from leaning forward to wrap her arms around him. Instead, he shrugged on the top of his shihakusho, focused on his thigh, and raised a brow. The charge they've accused her with is associating with the enemy. They have stated evidence collected through Reiatsu samples that she had interacted semi-regularly with a member of the Quincy race and reportedly is interacting and in collusion with known fugitives. Don't most of the people in Soul Society believe the Quincy are extinct and the whole fugitives thing is a covered slip or whatever? Ichigo questioned as if rationalizing it and adding some logic would make it easy to accept. It didn't work. Kisuke stared into the distance with a stony expression and Yoruichi pursed her lips as she continued, "Yes. And the sentence is execution by the Sokyoku. Most of Soul Society is in an uproar. Half of them simply want to follow the Central 46 like obedient children, the other half are outraged at the sentence. It's complete chaos. It doesn't make sense. Why would Aizen choose to act now, unlike this?" He has no proof of the presence of the Hogyoku in Rukia, and it's not subtle, in fact it's the complete opposite. Ichigo said out loud with a frown that was maybe more of a pout even as his heart picked up again in his chest and he finished healing the gash on his thigh. Kisuke nodded and his frown deepened and his fingers trailed through the dirt in aimless patterns. It didn't make sense. Aizen was all about complicated plans that had backup plans for his backup plans. Something this loud, this messy, while dramatic, and he was definitely a dramatic BSTRD, wasn't his style. There had to be something else going on.
Do you think you'll be ready to leave by tomorrow, Ichigo?
Yoruichi questioned, smiling at him softly in a way that made Yoruichi look younger than she was, softened her features until it was just Yoruichi and not someone who had been betrayed. Ichigo nodded. They were ready as much as they would ever be, and that was all he could take. He didn't have another option.
Do you know when they've scheduled the execution date?
Kisuke questioned and Yoruichi nodded and shook her head as if it would toss the bad thoughts away like water off a cat as she replied, in a week. Ichigo's fingers dug into the folds of his shirakusho as he forced himself to breathe through his nose. They had a week to save Rukia. The chaos in Soul Society would probably make it easier, but they were still invading a literal government with a group of teenagers. It would be fine. Maybe. Probably not. You should go home, Ichigo, get some sleep. Or roof dwelling, as he likes to call it. Yoruichi interrupted with a grin. Ichigo shook his head and rolled his eyes. She joined him sometimes so she didn't get to make fun of him. He felt like he could sleep for 7 years and at the same time run a few marathons. It was all jumbled up inside him, leftover reiatsu, nerves, and a pile of skin and bones that ached. Kisuke shifted forward and he wasn't really one for physical affection, but his arms around Ichigo were warm and heavy in the same way Zangetsu's were, except Kisuke was a lot heavier.
You still need to speak to Isshin, don't you?
Kisuke questioned in a barely there whisper and Ichigo nodded, wondered if it would erase the acid burning its way through his stomach and into his throat. A gentle hand stroked through Ichigo's hair and it pulled the tension with it till Ichigo was nothing but a bundle of warmth and nerves gathered together. Ichigo pulled back a moment later and rose to his feet with a crack of his spine. He could probably listen to encouraging speeches all day and it wouldn't make a difference. At that moment, he needed to be home with his family, in the warmth with Yuzu's cooking and their dad's antics. Because tomorrow they began. The air in the training area felt stifling, sweltering, and hot even though it was all climate-controlled and usually rather temperate. It was probably just Ichigo. He shifted and adjusted the collar of his shirt and decided that it was definitely him, and the way his stomach seemed to jump and twist inside his chest, crawling its way up behind his throat.
Did he have a good reason to be nervous?
Yes. 100% yes, because they were about to enter Soul Society, the afterlife with its own military and government, and there were 5 of them. Ichigo breathed in through his nose and forced his hand through his hair and straightened his spine. He was the leader, he had to present a good example, had to be tough, strong, unbreakable, assured, courageous, etc. Ichigo was the only one who had had any interaction with Soul Society. He was the only one who had any idea of what they were up against. He really shouldn't have involved everyone else. They had no idea about the kind of power a captain wielded, enough to decimate a city. It was kind of sort of totally terrifying. Ichigo breathed out and glanced up from his hands. Zangetsu was a wave of reassurance around him, pulling all the nerves gathered up inside him and tying them into a knot that wasn't quite as bad but still there, natural but not overwhelming. Kisuke was fiddling with the device they needed to enter through so that their still alive bodies could exist in Soul Society. Technically speaking, if they were separated from their bodies, they would be dead, and that was pretty much a very bad idea. Hence the large hulking mess of metal that Kisuke had thrown together in 2 nights with copious amounts of coffee and duct tape, maybe a bit of science. Yoruichi was curled on an unoccupied part of the machine, her tail flicking lazily even as she studied Kisuke with intent golden eyes. Tessai was standing next to Kisuke, handing him whatever tool he asked for and superstitiously glancing into the distance where Yururu and Jinta were scrabbling with one another, or rather Yururu was hitting Jinta because he had insulted her. The only spirit visible was Benihime. She was leaning languidly against her wielder's back and gently fanning herself, she saw Ichigo and winked once before returning to the elegant act of smoking her kizaru. His eyes darted towards the ladder. His friends would be there any minute and then they would leave. It still felt a bit surreal, everything did, from Rukia to the act of actually going to Soul Society. Like some strange fever dream, Ichigo had conjured up after getting sick from staying out in the rain again. A part of him had always known he would get involved with Soul Society somehow. It was an unfortunate inevitability, but this felt too soon, too sudden. He felt severely underprepared. But he had to do this, wanted to do this as much as he was scared. He had made a promise to Rukia, and the thought of her being executed twisted his stomach, burned itself through his veins far more than any nervousness about entering Soul Society, and maybe that was what Aizen wanted, maybe he was being too impulsive. The trapdoor to the training area clattered open, and a moment later, in an outfit that radiated Quincy aura, Yuri clambered down the ladder. He almost looked like a descending star, and Ichigo pressed his palm against his forehead and muffled a groan. He got Quincy pride, honestly, he did. Sken had driven home the point more than once about representing the last of your race, and Soul Society was technically the enemy of the Quincy, but still, subtlety. Orihime followed behind. He could almost hear her chatter, and she looked as if she might fall down the ladder at any moment as she waved with one hand while also observing and gushing over the training area. Again! Yuri must have thought the same thing because Ichigo could see him glancing up at her every other minute. Tatsuki followed behind, gloves tugged over her hands, and the new boots Ichigo had shoved onto her on her feet. She was frowning, and it was the same frown Ichigo wore. It made him think of how some people thought they were related. And that made him think of his family and trying to say goodbye. Chad was the last to descend, and Ichigo forcefully tugged his thoughts to his friends watching as they all gathered at the end of the ladder before walking over. Ichigo stared at them, tried to engrave the moment in his mind. He wasn't quite sure why, but it felt necessary. He did know why. Wow, Kurosakiku, it's so cool here. The machine is so big, are we going to go through it? Why? Orihime questioned once she was within talking distance, clasping her hands over her chest and beaming at him with all the force of the sun. Ichigo blinked and turned haplessly to Kisuke, who grinned at him from beneath the brim of his striped hat, and Ichigo mentally cursed his uncle. Under his breath, he questioned, "Why can't we just use a Garganta?" Before he smiled slightly, it was probably more of a grimace, at Orihime, and responded, "It converts our racial or something so that we can enter Soul Society without dying." "You know why we can't use a Garganta, Ichigo?" Kisuke said as he walked over SWNGNG his cane in a manner that was far too cheerful. Even if Ichigo could sense the way Kisuke was actually worried, Benihime only smoked like that when Kisuke was worried. Ichigo nodded with a sigh, and when Tatsuki tilted her head, Ichigo shrugged and said, "A Garganta uses hollow Reiatsu. It would kind of be like sending up an attack signal. Still, I doubt we'll be able to avoid the cleaner." "Doubting my skills again, Ichigo?" "The cleaner?" Yuri questioned and adjusted the glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. Ichigo nodded and let Kisuke handle the explanation because Chad was looking at him and Ichigo knew what he was asking. He nodded and Chad tilted his head slightly, and it was enough to settle something in his chest to know that Chad was there. For a moment there was silence. Kisuke had finished his explanation, and really all that was left to go. They had trained for the past almost a week as much as possible. They had planned, talked about Soul Society, how it was governed, who to be cautious about, where Rukia was being held. There really wasn't anything left to say. Ichigo kind of wished there was. He turned to his friends, stared at each of them in turn, and in a split second, decided that maybe there was one more thing to say. "I can't tell you what's going to happen when we go to Soul Society. But I will tell you that I believe in us, and you should too. We're going up against a government, but we have more than a few surprises up our sleeves, and I want you all to know that I will not leave you behind. I will not let anything happen to you as long as it is within my power, ever. We're going to save Rukia." They stared back at Ichigo, determination like carved stone on their features heavy between them all. They were ready. Kisuke smiled, subtle and barely noticeable, but Ichigo could practically feel his uncle's pride as he started up the machine. It cranked and groaned, shuddered once, and then the Senkaiman opened in a swirl of Reiatsu. Yoruichi leapt onto Ichigo's shoulders, and with a nod, he stepped forward confident the others were behind him. The moment the Senkaiman closed behind them, trapping them in a vortice of darkness and plasma like something out of a sci-fi movie, Ichigo broke into a sprint and he could hear the others following behind. They couldn't afford to be slow, not with the cleaner patrolling the Dangai precipice. He focused on the running, on his breath and the sound of footsteps behind him and tried to ignore the plasma on all sides, the way Zangetsu bristled with discomfort at this place that twisted between time and dimensions. "Kurosaki, I think we have a problem," Yuri called out, and his voice was sharp and clinical, but Ichigo could hear the note of fear lodged behind it. He cursed and turned, jerked his head and let Yuri run ahead. He was good at controlling his Reiatsu, the best of them. The light was at the end of the tunnel, but there was one that was approaching behind Orihime, and Ichigo cursed because that was just their luck. He motioned Tatsuki and Orihime ahead of him and materialized Zangetsu even as he followed behind the group. His breath was quick in his lungs and his mind was attempting frantic mental calculations about whether they would make it or whether Ichigo would be able to hold it off long enough for his friends to escape. In the worst-case scenario, which he was inevitably contemplating, he could always try and use a Garganta. They were close. Ichigo could see blue sky behind the light at the end of the tunnel, and yet at the same time the cleaner was on their heels. Ichigo turned and gathered his Reiatsu. It wouldn't be as great as a Getsuga Tensho, but it would probably slow the cleaner down just enough for them to get out. He waited, gathering his Reiatsu and staring blindly into the light of the clearer as plasma flowed around him, threatening to consume him in the same way the cleaner did. Ichigo breathed and raised Zangetsu against his chest. Reiatsu burst from Zangetsu's blade, and Ichigo didn't spare a minute to check if it had worked. He turned and ran, chasing after the flash of Orihime's hair and Yuri's clothing. Then he was falling. They all were. Ichigo cursed Kisuke with every word he had learned from the local Yakuza, Hiyuri, and Hachi as they fell through the air into what was clearly a district of Rungakai if the old-fashioned houses were anything to go by. The landing was rough. Ichigo rolled to his feet and coughed out the dust clinging to his clothing before turning, and in a blur of Reiatsu, he caught Orihime gently in his arms and settled her on her feet. Tatsuki had landed in a crouch, dust kicked up around her, and she looked awesome, almost epic. Yuri was frowning and dusting off his shirt as he stared at their surroundings, daring any passing citizen to comment on the random teenagers that had fallen from the sky. Chad was carefully helping Yoruichi onto his shoulder, and Ichigo caught his eye and tilted his head in a silent check if he was okay. Chad nodded. Ichigo wasn't quite sure if he was okay. His heart was still hammering in his chest, his palms felt sweaty and shaky, and the last few minutes played themselves through his mind in high speed and what ifs. He glanced at their surroundings. Rungakai was what Ichigo had expected, something out of the past and rich in poverty. It made sense in a sad sort of way. Ichigo took a breath and glanced to Yoruichi. She was their guide now, and they needed to keep moving. Even amidst the chaos of Rukia's execution, it wasn't safe to challenge Soul Society's security. "What's the plan, Yoruichi-san?" Orihime questioned with a tilt of her head as Tatsuki checked her over, rubbing a gentle hand over a bit of dust on her cheek. They all turned their eyes to Yoruichi, whose gaze went distant for a moment before her eyes shifted to Ichigo with all the sudden force of a drill to bedrock. "We can attempt to enter through one of the gates to Serete. It's guarded by Judambo, who is honorable and will let us enter if we defeat him in battle. I'm sensing an awe here." Ichigo responded even as he considered it. If they fought Judambo, it would be quick access to Serete, but Ichigo doubted that Aizen would allow for such an easy entrance. He probably had them all monitored. If Ichigo was being honest, the megalomaniac had everything monitored. "You're right, Ichigo. There is another way into Soul Society. The Shiba clan head has a method of entry that is mildly explosive. I personally think it would be best to attempt entry through the gates, as both are equally noticeable on Soul Society's radar, but it is up to you as a group to make a decision," Yoruichi stated, blinking her golden eyes at him, and Ichigo could almost hear what she wasn't saying. He wasn't as good as Kisuke at it, but he was a quick study. She was right though. It was a group decision. Ichigo had no doubt that he could defeat the Gate Guardian. They probably acted more as a deterrent for the local bandits. Yuri shifted, just slightly, in a way that managed to convey how uncomfortable he felt in the open. Ichigo could feel it too. Tatsuki crossed her arms over her chest and stared at the world around them with a furrow between her brow. Orihime was doing the same, except she looked excited to be here. Ichigo glanced to Chad, who was staring at Ichigo, and he knew what it meant, a promise of loyalty tied between them like the gravitational pull of the earth and moon. "I think we shouldn't go through the gate, someone could get hurt," Orihime stated, and Tatsuki stared at her for a moment before she turned her eyes on Yoruichi and added, "The Shiba clan leader, they don't like Soul Society, right? They'll help us?" Yoruichi nodded and Yuri scoffed, adjusted his glasses and finished, "It's probably going to be far more subtle than a display of aggression. Not that Soul Society would understand the difference between either." They all stared at Ichigo, and he forced himself to realize he felt Zangetsu's presence wrap around him. "He could do this," he stated. "We'll try the Shiba clan head. If that doesn't work out, we'll try the Gate Guardian." Yoruichi stared at the five of them. He thought he could see her spirit fluttering around her, and Ichigo knew that they might have made the right decision as she nodded and jumped onto the ground with a quiet, "Follow me." So, they did. They walked through the streets of Rungakai, and Ichigo couldn't keep his eyes off of the buildings. Maybe buildings was a nice word. They were almost all shacks, and the people who inhabited them were an eclectic mix of people who traded and bartered at the stalls and sat on their porches smoking. The sun beat down heavy around them, and Ichigo almost felt withered, emptied out, and a bit sad for these citizens, people who were vulnerable to hollow attacks and lived outside the walls of a literal shining white city. The small rural town slowly gave way to fields of rice growing under the shade of passing clouds tended by the local farmers and citizens, and from there to forests thick and tall springing up around them and providing a heavy coverage from the sun that chilled Ichigo's skin. He resisted the urge to ask how much longer or rub at his arms, and instead listened to Orihime and Tatsuki pleasantly discuss a new TV show while Yuri added something every so often. The forest ended and they arrived at a clearing. Ichigo could see a house, a few stories tall and with a crimson accent that seemed weathered and old. The whole thing, even with the damage, practically radiated nobility. In front of the house were two large fists made of dirt, holding a sign. Ichigo blinked and squinted at the sign but couldn't make out anything. He turned to ask Yoruichi, but at the expression on her face, very much that cat that got the canary, decided against it. Stepping forward, Ichigo walked up to the front doors and knocked, ignored the breath held tense inside his chest and waited. Silence lingered for a long moment, and Ichigo wondered if the clan head was even at home, if there was even anyone living in the slightly derelict-looking house. The doors clicked open and there stood a woman with one arm, spiky black hair, and the same nose as his dad. Ichigo blinked, made the quick connection even as he saw the hurt, pain, grief flash over her features, and made another half-thought connection. He bowed and straightened and watched as she blinked once before her gaze drifted to Yoruichi and she plastered a bright, fake smile across her lips. "Yoruichi, why have you brought me a gang of teenagers? Ganju didn't try to recruit them, did he? Speaking of, where is the useless brat?" "No, Kaku, this is Ichigo Kurosaki and his friends. They've come to rescue Kuchiki-san because of the execution and they need a way to enter Serete," Yoruichi stated as she jumped to the ground and let Kaku pick her up. Absently, Kaku's hand stroked through her fur and her eyes sharpened, suddenly like steel, as she studied the five of them. Ichigo stared back, let everything inside him, the fear, the anger, the determination, out like a tidal wave. After all, this was his extended family. He needed to make a good impression. A moment later, Kaku grinned, bright and wicked in a way that Ichigo had seen on Karen's face when she was plotting something. She stepped back and with a wink stated, "Well, you better come inside. We can sort out everything over tea." From the roof of the Shiba household, Ichigo couldn't see much. The sun had dipped below the horizon an hour or so before and left only the vague shadows of the forest. The sky was probably normally filled with a sea of stars twinkling at the world below, but the night was overcast and the only thing that felt real was Ichigo's breath and the strong roof beneath him. He wondered if the stars in Soul Society were different than those in the mortal world. Hueco Mundo didn't have stars. Ichigo remembered that vividly, a blank expanse of black broken up only by the grinning moon that followed your every step. Ichigo's fingers clenched reflexively and scraped idly over the roof tiles. They were rough. He missed Ashido, missed his easygoing smile that erased the lines around his eyes and his quiet humor. He missed his family with something pungent, like a door rain in the spring, washing over old grey snow and painting the streets in runny colors. The worst part was perhaps the fact that Ichigo knew the spring rains would end, and with it, they would bring flowers and buds on the trees. but he didn't know if he would go back if he would have the chance to stop missing his family. It was terrifying to consider that he wouldn't go home, that he wouldn't taste Yuzu's cooking or argue with Karen over who's better at math. The answer was neither, wouldn't be able to listen to Kisuke ramble about particle theories or waves of light. He would probably even miss his dad. Ichigo wondered if the others were thinking the same thing, if they were sleeping peacefully or tossing and turning, knowing that tomorrow they would be launched into the very heart of the Gotei 13. Orihime and Tatsuki were probably curled together in the guest bedroom Kaku had shoved them into. Tatsuki was probably still awake worrying about what tomorrow would bring because she was like Ichigo. Orihime was probably dreaming about a robot invasion with crabs or another wild fantasy. Yuri was probably sleeping, fingers twined around his Quincy cross, while Chad was sleeping on the other side of the room doing that thing where he just stared at the ceiling for a while. "You're brooding too much, Ichi." Zangetsu said the words light, and the spirit's arms were suddenly around Ichigo, a line of warmth like a fire in the tepid air outside. It had been hot, almost muggy during the day, but the air only felt stale now, not even cold enough to chill. Ichigo didn't disagree because he brooded, in the same manner that Yuri sewed when he was worried, or Chad would run his fingers over the coin from his grandpa. Maybe Ishigo's coping mechanism was counterproductive and a little bit negative, but it had always been how he coped. Or at least it was after his mom died. Before then he probably just ran to her. It was strong to remember the little details after so many years. The memories were still strong and he could picture her smile with ease, but the exact way she smelled, the words she always hummed under her breath around the house, those were harder to remember. Ichigo couldn't imagine what it was like for his sisters who had lost their mother at such a young age. He thought they've turned out all right, but maybe he wasn't the best of judge of okay. Only a little. Zangetsu snorted at his response, and Ichigo shivered slightly as his spirit tugged at his hair and dragged his nails over the back of his neck. He could feel his spirit's longing for a spa, something to take Ishigo's mind off of everything and maybe wear him out. But Ichigo ignored the teasing, already tired, just not enough. Zangetsu huffed and Ichigo could almost see the pout on his face even as Zangetsu left it alone. It was okay to be worried, to be anxious, as long as it didn't affect Ichigo in battle. Being tired would affect him in battle though. There was a shuffle, a clatter of something against tile behind Ichigo. He tensed for a moment, folded his fingers into the kimono Kaku had moved on him before his Reiatsu snaked out and settled against Zangetsu's chest. A moment later, the mysterious intruder settled beside Ichigo, crossing her legs and staring out at the same shapeless landscape Ichigo had been staring at for the past few hours. Maybe it's a Shiba thing to brood on top of roofs at night. Kyan always used to do it before an exam or a meeting. Ichigo turned his head slightly to stare at his aunt. In the darkness he could only make out the pale skin of her face, eyes soft and distant, and the red of the kimono slipping casually off her shoulder. Ichigo blinked and considered the statement. He wondered if his father had done the same. Probably. Kaku snorted a rough bark of laughter and tilted her head back, leaning on the palms of her hands to stare up at the cloudy sky. Silence lingered for a moment and Ichigo was unsure how and if he wanted to break it. He didn't know too much about his aunt other than her similar personality traits to his father and the devil-may-care attitude she exhibited with a pleased glow. It was certainly strange meeting extended family. For years it had only been the Kurosaki family, just the four of them, and sometimes a brief dinner with Ishida's family where their fathers glared at each other silently and Sken had attempted to keep the peace. He had known, from the history, Benihime liked to cram down his throat on occasion, that his father belonged to the Shiba clan and that they were one of the largest clans, or had been, but the idea of extended family had never been a serious thread in his mind. "Your old man doing okay?" Kaku questioned, rolling over slightly to lie casually on the tiles and stare up at Ichigo. It couldn't be that comfortable. Ichigo tilted his gaze to stare at her, wondered at all the unsaid history, and after a moment he nodded and replied, "Yeah, as much as the maniac could ever be." She blinked and Ichigo could almost sense an unfinished thought or a question lingering on the forefront of her mind, but instead, she shook her head and stared up at the night sky. In between one breath and the next she began, "After your father left for the mortal world it was just us and Kyan, our older brother. He took over the duty of clan head. The clan really fell apart. Kyan tried his hardest to keep us all together, but he wasn't really ready for the responsibility and he didn't have the power to control the Central 46 either. It was strange to see our family shrink. Some went off to Rungakai, others married into other clans, some disappeared. But most of us are still around. When you get back to the mortal world, and you're going to get back, kid, give your old man a punch on the shoulder, K. And next time bring your sisters. Ichigo processed the paragraph of words, staring up at the slow-moving hurdle of a few clouds. They revealed a collection of stars before they were slowly covered again. So Kyan had been related to him, his uncle or cousin technically. There was a strange sense of loss in his chest, like a second-hand loss, the feeling that he would never get to know all the members of his clan because of Aizen. Yeah, sure. Ichigo responded with a grin because Karen would love Kaku and absolutely demand she teach her all of her secrets, and Yuzu would totally love Ganju. They would get on like a house on fire full of culinary recipes. Kaku nodded, and out of the corner of his eyes Ichigo could see a pleased smile curling across her lips.
You really think we're going to make it home?
Ichigo questioned, the words springing forth from the part of him that couldn't reassure himself completely. After all, Kaku knew about Soul Society, knew accurately or least close to what their chances were. His aunt shifted on the tiles, and a bright flare of fire lit the air like a firefly as she brought it to the pipe stuck into her mouth. For a moment there was nothing, no wind to rustle the trees or cicadas chirping, just the slow winding spiral of smoke and their breaths. She turned to him with grey eyes, the kind that had a way of staring right through you. If Ichigo did that to his friends he could kind of understand why they avoided emotional confrontations. She smiled, wicked and wide, and said, "Kid, I think you'll destroy the Gotei 13, maybe not physically, but you're going to rip a hole in their psyche and force them to heal it properly." Kaku stood up before Ichigo could respond and ruffled a hand through his hair, that same grin and two bright eyes as she finished, "Get some sleep, kiddo," and turned clambering down the roof and out of sight like a badass. Ichigo grinned for a moment at his hands, pale and like spilt milk on the kitchen floor at Tuum for a moment before a yawn broke through his reverie, and with a sigh he shifted to his feet. "I like her," Zangetsu commented as Ichigo slipped into the guest bed. Ichigo snorted because yeah, his aunt was cool and maybe she was right. Ichigo would make sure she was right. X. The landing in Serete was rough, a bright and loud mess that probably exceeded their initial entry to Soul Society in noticeability. Ichigo doubted the other option would have worked out any better. He picked himself out of the rubble and dusted off the sleeves of his shihakusho, old uniforms Kaku had shoved on them with sad eyes, some fit and some did not, and glanced at their surroundings. Serete was white, glaringly and utterly blindingly white in the manner out of a dystopian novel with an oppressive government they had read in class. Ichigo instantly kind of hated it in the same moment that he contemplated the upkeep required to keep everything looking so pristine. Honestly, way too much white. Ichigo turned to stare at his friends. Orihime was bouncing around on her feet, flitting from one wall to the next to stare at it with wide eyes like they were tourists in the middle of a culturally interesting place rather than a white-bricked maze. Tatsuki was watching Orihime with an exasperated expression, arms crossed over her chest as she shifted from foot to foot and dusted off the debris clinging to the back of her uniform. Ganju, who had begged to come but only on the agreement that it wasn't for revenge, was scowling stiff and tense in the pale morning sunlight. Yuri was also scowling. It was almost his typical scowl, but Ichigo could sense there was something more, like Soul Society, dug beneath one's skin. If it recognized you as an outsider, it probably did. Chad was standing with Yoruichi on his shoulders, staring down at the decent crater and wreck of a wall they had left with their entry. He inhaled once and tried to smooth out the tense line of his spine. He felt like there were 100 red scope targets on his back and a band across his chest branded with a kill on sight order. Zangetsu's presence rippled across his chest and Ichigo exhaled slowly. They needed to keep moving. They couldn't wait for Shinigami to come and arrest them. They had the element of surprise. They needed to use it. Yoruichi, do you know which building Rukia is being detained in? Ichigo questioned, tilting his head as a dull blaring sound that could only be an alarm started to ring through the air. Yoruichi cocked her head and blinked once slowly and languidly in the manner only a cat could manage before she replied, "The rumor is she's being held in Central 46's personal cells or the 1st Division." Great! Ichigo resisted the urge to curse and instead ran a hand through his hair, tugging at the strands for a moment in an attempt to ease the stress piling onto his shoulders like a construction zone with a mound of dirt. It made sense she was being held in such a high-security area due to the nature of her arrest. But it still felt unfair. He spread his Reiatsu outwards and could feel the incoming presence of 2 Shinigami with various others in the area likely heading their way. Ichigo glanced at his friends, just teenagers nervous and a bit unsure in the morning sunlight against the 2 pale drop back, and made a decision. Yoruichi, please find out where Rukia is being kept. In the meantime, we'll split up, as a large group will draw too much attention. The captains can't spare most of their forces due to infighting, and we already have disguises. Move around and try to get a general feeling of how Seirete is viewing this situation. We meet back in, what's a noticeable location, Yoruichi? Try the 13th Division, they always help lost Shinigami, and you could take Taisho is Rukia's captain. Alright, meet at the 13th Division in 2 hours, ask for directions. Yuri accompany Tatsuki and Orihime, Chad go with Ganju, and I'll accompany Yoruichi until it isn't safe, okay? Ichigo finished and hesitated, suddenly unsure if his plan was okay, if it would work. They probably should have planned the whole mission more, but there was only so much planning one could do without any information. Part of Ichigo nagged that there were ways they could have gotten that information, but not without a sacrifice of surprise, or well, the risk of Aizen. They stared back at him and Ichigo could almost feel the hesitation, but then it was gone as quickly as the laughter in a funeral parlor, and they were staring at Ichigo. He could feel their resolve like a physical strength lingering and building as the sirens wailed on and on in the background. Yoruichi casually leapt from Chad's shoulders to the ground. She turned to peer at the 5 of them and said, "Be careful, be quiet, don't fight anyone you don't have to, make allies if you can." Then she was climbing onto Ichigo's shoulder, and the moment was suspended between them where they were all waiting for someone else to move. No one wanted to be the first to leave. Chad caught Ichigo's eyes. He could feel the 2 Shinigami approaching just around the street corner. He nodded once and Ichigo repeated the motion. They understood what would happen. Chad turned, snagging Ganju by his collar and pulling him down a side street. Like that the moment was broken, Orihime waved at Ichigo. Tatsuki nodded once, and Yuri adjusted his glasses with an imperative demand of his name that ordered he survive. Then they were gone, and it was just Ichigo and Yoruichi, and the street suddenly felt too tight and ever-expanding all at once. Yoruichi's claws dug lightly into his shoulder, startling Ichigo from twisting thoughts with the pinpricks of pain. He scowled up at the cat on his shoulder, who only blinked down at him with something like a grin as she said, "You made the right choice, Ichigo. Your friends will be fine, and you are by far still taking too much after Kisuke." Ichigo couldn't keep frowning at the fond, almost proud words, and instead nodded and let his hands drift to where Zangetsu was secured at his side. He could feel his spirit humming with a low buzz of excitement at the thought of fighting trained Shinigami. Yoruichi jumped gracefully down from Ichigo's shoulders and landed on the pavement, a spot of ink against a blank canvas. She turned to Ichigo and winked once before she turned and sauntered off. Ichigo wished her luck even if she didn't need it. He tensed as footsteps rounded the corner, 2 people, and then consequently forced himself to untense, knowing that while Soul Society had a strike first ask later type of manner, Ichigo wasn't dressed like an enemy, and there were a lot of Shinigami in Soul Society. The first one to round the corner was a bald Shinigami with flares of red around his eyes, and the Reiatsu of probably a lieutenant. The Shinigami that followed had black hair, feathers around his eyes, and an orange scarf. They paused when they saw Ichigo and traded a look with one another, the kind that said close friends before the bald one strode over, fingers casually skirting over the hilt of his Zanpakuto 2. Everyone was on edge. Ichigo bowed in greeting and waited for the Shinigami to speak, eyes flickering to the other Shinigami who had followed, staring at Ichigo with sharp eyes that betrayed the harmless aura. "Ori, I haven't seen you before? A recent graduate. Well, have you seen any Ryoka? Rumor is that they were spotted in this area, and Kenpachi Taisho ordered us to find the Ryoka first. Not too sure how many there are. How many do you think, Yumichika?" The bald Shinigami questioned after staring closely at Ichigo, who nodded along with the wide eyes of someone who was terribly inexperienced with dealing with superior officers. The other Shinigami, Yumichika, stared at Ichigo for a moment more before he glanced at the crater in the wall and shrugged as he responded, "Oh, I don't know, it could be an army or one ruse person." Kenpachi Taisho said there was a lot of Reiatsu in whoever broke through the barrier. "What division did you say you were in?" "I think I would have recalled seeing someone with such an interesting hair color at the academy during the recruitment fair."
CRP. What should he do?
Employ Benihim's lessons, right? Ichigo smiled, a nervous sort of smile, and tilted his head slightly towards the ground as he replied, I didn't attend the recruitment fair, I was unfortunately very sick. That's a shame, you probably would have liked the 11th. The bald Shinigami stated, staring at him again as if Ichigo gave off Ryoka vibes, as if there was a neon sign above his head just blinking about and saying, hey, fight me. Yumichika frowned and made a sympathetic sound before he turned to the bald Shinigami and with a raised brow stated, Ikaku, not everyone wants to work under Kenpachi Taisho. Besides, don't you remember the lecture Unohana Taisho gave us on trying to recruit other divisions Shinigami? At the mention of the infamous Unohana Taisho, who Ichigo secretly and unwisely wanted to meet, the two Shinigami shivered and Ikaku, the bald one, paled and nodded with a frown. They both turned to stare at Ichigo again before Ikaku asked, You sure you haven't seen any Ryoka? No. Then why are you hanging around here with this rubble? There wasn't a fight, everyone knows the Sutaisho prohibited it. Unless the Ryoka entered here. Yumichika stated, stroking a finger along the edge of his jaw and glancing idly at the mess of broken bricks and tile collected on the floor. Was it suddenly hotter, or was that just the sun rising? Ichigo inhaled slightly and shrugged, forcing a casual slant to his shoulders as he replied, I just got here, Yukatake Taisho sent a few of us out to investigate. That's funny, cause last I heard Yukatake Taisho was still resting after another attack from his illness. Ikaku stated, peering at Ichigo with sharp eyes that turned the lines of his face into angles, and suddenly Ichigo could see a Shinigami of the Gotei 13 in front of him as he asked, What did you say your name was again? My name is Ichigo Soto, Soto, the name of one of their neighbors who owned far too many cats, one of which liked to sneak into his room during the summer and sleep on his face, which Ichigo honestly didn't mind, and of course Yukatake Taisho gave the orders to his lieutenants who told us. Ichigo did a little dance inside his mind at the fact he had remembered the 13th Division had 2 lieutenants. He only knew that because Rukia had complained of their squabbling a few times. Ikaku and Yumichika shared a look. It was the kind he and Yuri sometimes traded with each other when they were speaking without words. Oh, are you going to the Men's Shinigami Association meeting on Thursday? Yumichika asked with a sudden burst of cheer and almost literal flying sparkles. Everything inside Ichigo's head screamed out that it was a trap in unison, and yeah, Ichigo knew it was obvious, that somehow it was a trick question. Maybe Yumichika had said the name wrong, maybe the club didn't exist, maybe they met on a Tuesday not a Thursday. But Ichigo didn't know the truth, and even deductions only worked so well. Ichigo sent a silent apology to Benihim. After all, he had been doing so well too. He didn't even have a fake communicator like the ones Rukia used to fake an escape. No? You see, Ryoka-san, the club doesn't meet on Thursdays, and any male Shinigami worth their salt knows that, even if they're not part of the club. Which means logically, of course, that you're the Ryoka. Ikaku stated, grinning like a wolf with its teeth bared as his Zanpakuto slid from its sheath with a hiss that was loud in the morning even amidst the still blaring alarms as Yumichika repeated the motion beside him. Ichigo thought about trying to defend himself. He was tired and had forgotten momentarily and really what was with the sudden inquisition. But it wouldn't go over well. Instead, he drew his Zanpakuto, Zangetsu practically vibrating in his hands as the dark blade seemed to slice through the walls around them. Wait! I have to do my lucky dance. Ikaku stated, and proceeded to launch into a strange dance with his Zanpakuto. Yumichika watched with a fond smile. Ichigo stared in bewilderment for a few seconds, but accepted it as a part of Soul Society and patiently waited. Part of him wanted to leap forward and strike while the enemy's guard was open, but that was kind of dishonorable and they weren't bad people, plus, Zangetsu would probably annoy him for hours if they didn't get to fight. Ikaku finished his dance and settled into a low stance, Yumichika at his side. He could tell instinctively that they had very different styles but knew well how to work with each other, and that they both had Shikai, he just couldn't let them use it. Ikaku disappeared in a blur of Reiatsu. Ichigo whirled around and caught his blade on the edge of Zangetsu, sparks flaring as Ikaku's greater strength pushed against Ichigo's own. He ducked, letting the blade pass harmlessly overhead as he twisted to the side and caught Yumichika's blade on Zangetsu's and began the incantation under his breath for one of the few Kido he could actually do. They moved in tandem and it was almost similar to trying to fight Kenshi and Mashiro, except they were wizard and were brutal when they trained. Ichigo ducked underneath an overhead strike and let the shaka explode from his hands and send Yumichika flying backwards to collide with the wall. Ikaku suddenly and swiftly pressed the offensive, backing Ichigo towards the crater as his blade hammered at Ichigo with a strength that made Ichigo's arms sting. He scored a gash across the Shinigami's cheek and rolled across the debris to avoid a strike from Yumichika as he grasped at a small handful of dust and crushed brick as he popped to his feet and felt Ikaku's breath across from Zangetsu's blade. He threw the dust into Ikaku's eyes and jabbed his elbow into Yumichika's stomach before putting a bit of space between himself and his opponents. Ikaku coughed and grinned, BLD staining his teeth as he turned to Yumichika and stated, "I like this Ryoka, he fights rough. Maybe he should join the 11th. Yumichika replied airily, and then they were advancing again. Ichigo sucked in a breath and felt Zangetsu's Reiatsu thrumming through his body with his own as he settled into the rhythm of battle, analyzing what he knew of his opponents. If the fight went on for too long, they would use their Shikai. Ichigo couldn't afford for that much of a commotion to be made. It would probably be a great distraction for his friends, but they needed anonymity and Ichigo kind of didn't want to be hunted by half of the Gotei 13. He narrowly dodged a slice against his chest only to have Yumichika score a gash on his arm. He was a tricky BSTRD. Ichigo whirled around and Yumichika wasn't fast enough to avoid his blade as it grazed his thigh. Ikaku was suddenly there in his space and Ichigo backpedaled, attempting to direct the force of Ikaku's strikes downwards. Sensing an opening, Ichigo stepped into a burst of Reiatsu and appeared behind Yumichika and with a well-placed blow to the head knocked him unconscious as he said, "Sorry, maybe we'll get to spar later." Ichigo flickered away in a burst of Reiatsu instinct, screaming to get far away. Ikaku crouched over his partner for a moment, checking his pulse before he stood up. He stared at Ichigo for a long moment before he said, "You're pretty honorable for a Ryoka. So, I'll show you my Shikai." "Great." Reiatsu gathered around Ikaku and Ichigo tensed, his fingers curling around the pommel as he made a split-second decision. In a burst of Reiatsu, Ichigo appeared in front of Ikaku and forced his blade up against Zangetsu as he smiled and said, "Sorry, maybe later." Ikaku grinned bloody and exhilarated as he shook his head and pushed forward. Ichigo ducked around an overhead strike, hissed at the gash scored across his chest and pushed back, relentlessly slipping from one move to the next. Grinning at the BLD pounding through his veins, the adrenaline filling his body, Ichigo twisted his Zanpaku too, in the same manner Kisuke had demonstrated over and over again, and Ikaku's blade clattered to the ground. "Good fight, huh?" Ichigo questioned, almost but not quite panting, as Ikaku blinked at him with a surprised expression before it turned into a grin. Ichigo knocked Zangetsu's pommel into the back of Ikaku's head and watched as the Shinigami collapsed. The air was suddenly quiet and Ichigo could hear his breathing loud as a thunderstorm in a tin shed as his fingers tightened reflexively on Zangetsu's hilt and he glanced around. The sirens had stopped and his Reiatsu couldn't detect anyone for a mile or so. It was safe enough. He sheathed Zangetsu and shook his hands out before crouching beside Ikaku and starting to heal his cuts. They were all pretty shallow. It had been a good fight, they were both skilled, and if Ichigo had had the time he would have fought their Shikai just to see it. Maybe later. But that was probably wishful thinking. Ichigo glanced at the sky as he moved over to Yumichika. In roughly 2 hours it would be noon and the sun would be hanging in the center of the sky, but for now, there was time. Once Yumichika was healed, Ichigo started on his own wounds, listening cautiously to the outside world. Even as Zangetsu practically purred inside his inner world, Ichigo was kind of feeling it too, even if the pervasive sense of danger still lingered like the beginnings of a cold. A shrill ringing sound filled the air. Ichigo tilted his head, suddenly tense, and glanced at his surroundings. There was nothing. The ringing went again, and Ichigo's eyes narrowed as his fingers dug into the pockets of his uniform and pulled out a battered blue phone. It wasn't his own and looked like something Jinta had probably used for a month and then gotten bored of. He narrowed his eyes as the phone continued to ring and wondered primarily how it had gotten there, Yoruichi, and how he had cell reception in Soul Society, Kisuke. He answered the phone. "Ichigo USCK. How could YA leave us all behind without telling us?" "Okay, yeah, you told Haji, but he doesn't count. We want revenge, you know?" And besides, you need backup. What's better than us? Lisa is staring at me and Rose wants me to tell you to be careful. Yes, love, I understand that Hollow Rietsu in Soul Society is kind of a problem. But still.
It's Ichi, you know?
Ichigo listened to Shinji's whining and background bickering with a fond smile as he rose to his feet and glanced around before ducking into a side alley. He was not tempting fate. He waited for Shinji to pause in his ramblings that were mostly just concern and interjected, "I'm fine, Shinji, seriously. Tell everyone I said hi, even Hiyuri, and that everything is okay so far. And maybe next time don't call, just text, because I kind of was just in a fight and that could have been bad timing. Okay, bye. Stay safe, kid," Shinji said after a moment where Ichigo could hear him squawking to whoever would listen in the background. Ichigo nodded and clicked the end call button, staring at the screen for a moment as the walls closed in around him and the euphoria of battle drained away. Ichigo inhaled, Rietsu thrumming through his veins, and pushed off the wall. They needed to save Rukia, he could worry later. Ichigo felt lost. He wasn't completely certain that he was lost, but the sense that the walls around him were the same ones he had passed 10 minutes ago settled into his stomach like the bottom of the ocean or the clay bed of a lake beneath your toes. Zangetsu was of no help. The spirit was as equally lost, and even Osen had no suggestion other than he at least knew whether he was going east or west because of the sun, or at least he would until noon when he needed to find the 13th division. It was almost like Serete was designed with the sole purpose of confusing intruders. He wondered idly if they gave out maps to new Shinigami and sent them off in some grand parody of that Greek myth they had discussed in class, the one with the maze and the Minotaur. With a sigh, Ichigo paused for a moment and leaned against a nearby wall, white brick and unchanging. He tilted his head back and basked in the faint sunlight and the quiet. It was a thick quiet, the kind that was almost tangible, and Ichigo's footsteps echoed off the paved streets as he walked, sounding like an army and nothing all at once. Spreading his Rietsu outwards, Ichigo searched for something, anything, even a Shinigami to ask directions from would work. For a moment there was nothing, or at least nothing close by, but it was strong to distinguish in Soul Society. The very ground itself seemed to swell with Rietsu, the air hummed with it, and the sheer amount of Shinigami was like standing in the midst of a storm or a plague of locusts. But then he sensed something, like a blip on a radar blinking into existence a short distance away. Rolling his shoulders, Ichigo's fingers hovered briefly over Zangetsu's hilt, and then he stepped forward in a burst of flash step. Ichigo slowed to a stop as the street he was walking down opened onto a small clearing. Buildings rose on either side and different streets branched off from the small, almost circular area. At the far end of the clearing, near a staircase, stood a Shinigami with bright red hair. Ichigo blinked and tilted his head, wondering if his eyes were deceiving him. So desperate for any sense of color that they had decided the Shinigami's hair would be red, it was still red, bright red. The Shinigami hadn't noticed Ichigo's presence. He was staring at the staircase, or rather past it, and Ichigo could almost see something forlorn to the slant of his shoulders. That was when he noticed the lieutenant's badge. Ichigo debated turning around. It was probably the smart thing to do. Fighting a lieutenant was dangerous. Fighting the Shinigami would probably draw all the wrong kinds of attention. But Ichigo was also incredibly lost, and he could probably pass for being a new Shinigami who was also terribly lost. Before Ichigo could attempt to make an awkward noise to get the Shinigami's attention, they turned and their gaze landed on Ichigo. They rose a brow and walked forward, and with emotion, Ichigo noticed the tattoos on their forehead, and upon closer distance, Ichigo ascertained they were probably a he. The Shinigami paused in front of Ichigo, tilted his head up and down as if studying him, and asked, "Lost?" Ichigo nodded helplessly and plastered a pleading expression across his features that wasn't at all faked. The red-haired Shinigami blinked and glanced down the street Ichigo had just come from with a quirk of his eyes that teased laugh lines there. "Yeah, it's easy to get lost here. Don't know why they keep sending Shinigami through here without putting up any signposts." Kuchiki Taisho even mentioned at least something orienting for Shinigami in case of emergencies. The Shinigami paused in a light-hearted talk and pinned Ichigo with a gaze that made him feel like he was a little kid getting a talking to from a concerned older sibling, so exactly how Yuzu and Karen felt. The Shinigami continued, "But you shouldn't be wandering around, it's dangerous. With the Ryoka invasion, they already murdered Aizen Taisho." "Aizen's dead?" Ishigo questioned and couldn't help the way the words launched themselves from his chest thick with disbelief because it simply wasn't possible. Benihime would probably yell at him later for losing his composure. But Aizen couldn't be dead. He wouldn't die that easily. There was no way he would die now of all time right in the middle of an unfolding plot. Yeah, it's a shame he was a nice enough guy, I guess, was even trying to help in Rukia's case. The Shinigami replied, mistaking Ishigo's disbelief for grief or surprise. Oh. It made sense. After all, if everything worked out in Aizen's favor, he wouldn't need a presence in Soul Society, and why wait when you could pin the murder on the Ryoka and add even more gasoline to the sun-sized fire? Ishigo cursed the man with every word he knew and combined them together with Zangetsu's helpful input.
Is there any word on Kuchiki-san's case?
Last I heard it was execution, which seems totally incorrect. Ishigo questioned, tilting his head to stare up at the slightly taller Shinigami. His expression was soured, and Ishigo wondered if he knew Rukia. The Shinigami shook his head with a scowl and crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze distant for a moment as he replied, "No, they are still attempting to go forward with the execution. Kuchiki Taisho is furious. I haven't seen him in 5 days, everyone is up in arms, but they're not going to change their minds. We'll probably have to go through." The Shinigami trailed off and blinked as if out of a daze and turned his gaze on Ishigo. And yeah, Ishigo kind of felt it too. It was easy to be in the Shinigami's presence. He wasn't threatening or anything, and maybe it was just the red hair, but he did give off an honorable sort of vibe that made it easy to trust him, even when Ishigo shouldn't. Though Ishigo got the feeling that in Soul Society they were either honorable or the exact opposite.
I don't think I've seen you before, though you look familiar. What's your name?
Okay, stay calm, everything was fine. It was a totally innocent and normal question to ask. Ishigo tilted his head slightly and scratched at the back of his head as he shrugged and replied, I don't get out much. Ishigo Kurosaki. Maybe he shouldn't have said his last name, that was probably a bad idea. Too late. The Shinigami blinked and stared at Ishigo once more, squinting in a way that pulled at the tattoos on his forehead. He said Ishigo's name under his breath and shook his head before he bowed slightly and replied, Arbarai Renji, Lieutenant of the 6th Division. Arbarai stared again, and Ishigo wondered what exactly was flicking switches in the lieutenant's mind. Maybe it was a similar appearance to his deceased cousin. Kaku had said they looked like twins in a manner that was almost freaky. Arbarai mentioned his name once more under his breath before he straightened, and suddenly the friendly countenance from before had disappeared. Ishigo internally groaned and wondered internally what had given him away. It wasn't like Aizen to write a death letter and sign it with Ishigo's name, so it had to have been something else. Rukia mentioned you. Good? Bad? Who knew? Not Ishigo. He stared up at Arbarai, fingers drifting towards his Zanpakuto, prepared at a moment's notice to unsheath Zangetsu. It was a shame their conversation had been going so well and Ishigo really didn't want to fight. Arbarai blinked and his eyes went wide as he moved hands slowly in front of his chest in the open gesture of peace. Whoa, it's okay, Rukia said you were a good kid. It's obvious she's not in jail because of you, or rather Central 46 is to blame from that lens, I think. Technically it was Ishigo's fault. He had become friends with Rukia, and yeah, his Reiatsu was strange. He had introduced her to Yuri, but most importantly he had become friends with her. He knew that Central 46 would justify their sentence with whatever they could get their shriveled old man mittens on, but really the crew was Aizen, who would do whatever he wanted to get what he wanted. And that seemed to be Rukia's execution. You spoke to her? Ishigo questioned, processing Renji's words. He knew Rukia, and she was a good judge of character, so this was probably okay, staring at the lieutenant with wide eyes even as the rest of him tried to unspool the threads of his thoughts. Renji nodded and tilted his head down, fingers brushing over the tattoos on his arm as he responded, yes, before the trial when they were still holding her in the Central 46 cells. She spoke of meeting you and the human world. Told me that you would be coming to Soul Society one day, and to keep an eye out for orange hair and too much Reiatsu. Wait, you haven't died, right? Ishigo shook his head at the suddenly panicked question and crossed out the Central 46 as Rukia's current location, even as he contemplated with a frown Rukia's accurate description of him. He felt there was more that wasn't being said, some sense of urgency hanging over both their heads the longer they stood in the clearing speaking about things that should probably be whispered about.
Then how are you here?
Renji continued with a tilt of his head that shook his hair and furrowed his brows.
Okay, the moment of truth.
Ichigo tried to smile, but it was probably a bit weak as he shrugged and replied, broke into Soul Society to save Rukia.
Broke into Soul Society to save Rukia.
She had said reckless but teenager.
Wait, doesn't that make you the Ryoka everyone is looking for?
Renji questioned, and the air was suddenly a bit cold once more. It wasn't as if Ichigo had accidentally stumbled into a freezer full of land mines, because there was the sense of the benefit of the doubt. But it was still kind of like ice sliding down his back. Ichigo glanced carefully up at Renji, looked into his eyes, and straightened his spine because he knew this much: he hadn't killed Aizen, and that was enough. If Ichigo had to fight Renji he would. He liked the red-haired Shinigami. But he wanted to save Rukia, and he needed to keep moving forward to do that.
Yes, but I didn't kill Aizen Taisho.
He waited, every line of his body tense, suspended, and waited like the moment before you go on stage, where anything could happen. Zangetsu hummed in the back of his mind, energy and warmth, the promise of strength that wouldn't fail them. Renji stared at Ichigo for a long moment with narrowed eyes and everything too sharp before he nodded once and said, "I believe you, you're not a killer kid." His shoulders slumped, all the tension draining from his body and leaving him suddenly boneless with relief. Renji placed a steadying arm on his shoulder, and suddenly Ichigo could see his spirit, a monkey with a snake for a tail curled around the feet of their wielder. Ichigo smiled slightly at Renji and shook away the last of the nerves. He nodded and straightened his spine.
What's really happening in Soul Society?
Ichigo questioned, tilting his head and glancing at Renji's Zanpakuto spirit for a moment before his gaze drifted to a nearby street. The shadows were longer now, and Ichigo couldn't help but glance at the sky, acutely aware of how much time he had left until they needed to meet outside of the 13th. It's been chaotic. Kuchiki Taisho, Rukia's brother, has constantly been in meetings. He's torn over whether to uphold the unjust law or to fight it and save Rukia as his honor would dictate. It's basically how all of Soul Society is feeling. It's an open secret that the 13 and by extension the 8th are planning mutiny. Everyone knows they're going to do something. The 11th's reveling in the chaos, and everyone is wound tight since Aizen Taisho was killed.
It's a mess.
Not to mention the execution had been moved up. It's in 2 days.
2 days? Do you know where Rukia is being kept?
Ichigo asked, processing the information that mostly followed what Ichigo already knew, but also a bit more. Like the fact that the execution had been moved from 5 days to 2. Most of it made sense, and Ichigo wondered what the blanket of chaos Aizen had created hoped to achieve. He was already fake dead. What did he need to hide? It's confidential, but most of us think the 1st Division, they wouldn't put her in the 2nd's prison. That's for the worst kinds of criminals, or so they say.
So, what's the plan? Tell me you invaded with a plan.
Ichigo sighed, because nothing could ever be too easy, could it? It was like all the forces in the universe were conspiring against him. A wave of Reiatsu slammed into the area, suddenly heavy and just there to kick you down and laugh about it, an untamed wild mess frothing about. His eyes widened and his head whipped around as he searched for whoever had such a large presence. It wasn't enough to bring Ichigo to his knees or even wind him, but it was still something. CRP, that's Kenpachi, the captain of the 11th. We have to leave, otherwise he'll force you into a fight, and that's not a good idea. Renji said, running a hand through the unruly spikes of his hair as he settled a hand firmly on the pommel of his Zanpakuto, and the fur on his spirit bristled. Ichigo nodded and quickly added, "My team is meeting at the 13th, hopefully, at noon. Be safe, Ichigo." Renji said with a nod, saying 100 other things without words before he turned and ran, disappearing down a street corner. For a long moment, Ichigo could see him like a speck of dirt on a camera lens before he was gone, and Ichigo was alone except for the horde of Reiatsu charging towards him. He wisely turned tail and ran. Ichigo's eyes darted around his surroundings as he skidded past the corner of a street, his lungs aching somewhere in his stomach and his breath rasping from his lips as he glanced hastily over his shoulder. How was it possible for the captain of the 11th Division, a division that specialized in fighting and little else, to be so good at tracking Ichigo's Reiatsu? It was like a bloodhound, or as if Ichigo had a neon sign above his head blinking loud and bright calling out, "Here I am." It didn't even make sense. No one knew Ichigo was the Ryoka, he was just a normal Shinigami with what appeared to be a bit more Reiatsu than normal. Maybe it was because he was giving chase or something. But Renji had also run, and it was unlikely that the captain simply chased after whoever he wanted. Who would do that unless they were completely insane? Ichigo slid to a stop and paused to lean against a wall, planting his hands on his knees as he tried to catch his breath. He was using Shuanpa and he was fast, but Seirete was also a complete and utter maze where Ichigo was forced to double back every 5 minutes as he slammed into a dead end or a fork in the road. The captain of the 11th, on the other hand, seemed to know these streets like the back of his palm. Ichigo was probably so far from their original point of entry that he was on the other side of the Gotei 13. As he ran a hand through his hair, Ichigo's eyes drifted upwards. He winced as the sun scorched his eyes, and with the stinging pain came the realization that the sun was almost sitting at the center of the sky. It was almost time for them to meet up, and Ichigo was completely and utterly lost with a captain chasing after him. Ichigo groaned and scrubbed a hand over his face before he straightened up and cast his Reiatsu out like a net with crossed fingers even as he observed his surroundings. He was in another dead end. Great! How was that even possible? How did a military area have so many dead ends? It didn't even logically make sense. Once again Ichigo assumed that the forces of the universe were not on his side for whatever reason. Maybe he had angered them in a past life. Oh, and the captain was approaching with no hope of Ichigo attempting to return the way he came from. With a sort of desperate humor, Ichigo wondered if it was all Aizen's fault if he had changed the architecture plans to contain too many dead ends and similar streets, all for the purpose of causing chaos. For a man who liked everything to be organized to the last detail, he also unfairly created too much chaos. Right, approaching captain who would probably not accept the answer no. Ichigo glanced at his surroundings. The only way to escape would be to take to the roofs. It would probably provide a better view of the streets. A part of Ichigo hesitated for exactly a second before he heard the clatter of approaching footsteps, and he decided that life over a sense of propriety was far more important. Ichigo stepped away from the wall and glanced at the entrance to the street. In the distance he could hear bells ringing. Ichigo tilted his head before, with a shake of his shoulders, he jumped onto the roof. A shingle gave way beneath his foot. Ichigo flailed for a moment, suspended on the edge and desperately composing a letter of apology to Yuzu because Karen would just come to Soul Society and demand an explanation herself. The shingle clattered to the street below and broke into shards with a crack that was too loud in the weird space of Ichigo's breathing, and as the bells, like the kind on children's toys, drew closer, Ichigo regained his balance and carefully settled both his feet on the roof as he glanced at the street below and beyond it. From the slightly elevated height, Ichigo could see a sea of white and the same almost orange but muted tiles he was standing on stretching out almost endlessly. Beyond it in the distance a hill rose towering over everything with something on top that glinted white. He wondered if it was the famed Sokyoku Hill, the place Rukia was to be executed at. The view suddenly wasn't all that great. The footsteps grew suddenly louder, and Ichigo screwed his head back onto his shoulder as he turned. He couldn't afford to be standing on a roof and staring into the distance. He almost wanted to ask what was wrong with himself, but he knew. It was Soul Society, the stress of trying to save Rukia, the freaking captain chasing him, the uncertainty, everything. But he needed to get his act together. Oi kid, fight me. Ichigo should run. He should just go and absolutely not turn around to look at the captain. The captain who was far too fast and was apparently a homicidal maniac. Ichigo pivoted slightly to stare at the captain of the 11th Division. He was a large man with a torn hari, an eye patch across one eye, and spiky hair with bells on the end. Ichigo stared for a long moment, ignoring Zangetsu's desperate pleading to fight the captain. He placidly responded, "Uno Hana Taisho has forbidden fighting in the streets." For a moment the captain's expression twitched into something like displeasure and another emotion that Ichigo couldn't decode before he shrugged and swung his Zanpakuto down at his side, sending a whirl of dust and Reiatsu into the air. Then a little girl with pink hair appeared. Ichigo stared for a long moment at the tiny girl sitting on the man's shoulder wearing a Shinigami uniform with a lieutenant's badge around her arm. Just what? Did Soul Society suddenly employ children? Hell, if I care what she says, you're strong, I can sense it. Fight me. Yeah, fight Ken-chan. Ichigo stared at both of them for a long even moment where he once more seriously contemplated his life. He turned and in a burst of Shianpa disappeared from the roof. He was not fighting a maniac with a kid on his shoulders. Just no. For too many reasons, no. A burst of Reiatsu was Ichigo's only warning. Zangetsu sung in his hands as he whipped around his feet, digging into a stance as the captain's blade slammed into Ichigo's own with all the force of a rhinoceros who had decided to mate with an elephant. Ichigo scowled and dug his feet into the cracked pavement, shoring his stance with Reiatsu as he glanced into the crazed eyes of the captain in front of him. In the distance, he could see the little girl sitting on a roof swngng her legs and watching the fight with wide entranced eyes. The fight that Ichigo really didn't want to participate in. He sprung back and debated turning tail and running. It was a cowardly sort of move, but Kisuke had enforced the lesson multiple times that tactical retreat was not a bad thing. Ichigo didn't even have time to look at the other street as the captain, Kenpachi the Shinigami had called him, was suddenly in his space once more. Ichigo turned his attention fully to the captain. He couldn't afford to divert his attention towards escaping. He would just have to end the battle as quickly as possible. Ichigo ducked under the broad swing of Kenpachi's blade and darted to the side in a burst of Shianpa, using it to push into the air as he brought his blade towards the captain's unprotected back. Kenpachi whirled around with a grin that was frankly terrifying and caught Ichigo's blade before bodily throwing him backwards. Ichigo rolled across the pavement and popped to his feet just in time for the captain to appear in his personal space once more. Their blades clashed against one another with a shower of sparks as Ichigo's feet slid and broke through the paved stones, Reiatsu swelling and building around them. Ichigo's head tilted slightly as he caught a faint echo from the captain's Zanpakuto. He didn't have time to analyze it as he was forced to bat aside an overhead strike. He retaliated and sliced his blade across Kenpachi's abdomen, drawing a line of BLD bright crimson against the off-white of his hari. The captain stepped back and Ichigo vaguely heard the little girl say something but couldn't focus on it as he watched the captain tilt his head back and begin to laugh. Definitely an insane BSTRD. The almost maniacal laughter slowed to a stop as the captain tilted his head to stare at Ichigo with a deranged grin that twisted something inside of Ichigo's chest, some primordial part of him that was screaming out fight or flight, but preferably the later. It made Ichigo wonder where the captain's Zanpakuto was. He hadn't seen anything, but there was something. Ichigo was forced to halt his consideration of the captain's Zanpakuto spirit or lack thereof when he rested his hand over his eye patch and carefully explained that he used it to seal over half of his Reiatsu. His stomach dropped in his chest and down to his toes for a moment even as Ichigo's fingers tightened on the hilt of his Zanpakuto, and he could hear Zangetsu in his mind, quiet and sure in the way where they both knew this wasn't a game. This was, after all, a captain, and the consequences weren't just bruises. Reiatsu flooded the air like a tsunami, like that biblical story where the sea itself parted, and Ichigo could see the captain's Reiatsu almost a sickly yellow as it battered at the buildings and flushed through the street. Ichigo stood still in the middle of a hurricane, his Reiatsu pulsing around him as he stared at the figure of the captain with narrowed eyes. There went any and all plans of subterfuge. Well, at least it would make it easier for Yoruichi to find him, her and the rest of Soul Society. That part of him that acted without thinking in battle and saved his life too often flared up, and before Ichigo could consciously contemplate the movement, his hands were gripping Zangetsu's hilt as the weight of Kenpachi's muscle and Reiatsu slammed into his shoulders, forcing Ichigo into the ground as a crater formed. He disappeared in a blur of Shianpa and appeared behind the captain, who had already whipped around to catch Ichigo's blade. He ducked to the side and his blade scored a gash against the captain's side, but he just laughed as he whipped around and their blades clashed with another shower of sparks. Ichigo began the incantation for Aikido under his breath as their blades clashed against one another, blurs of light and heat, and the captain grinned, BLD seeping from the shallow wound across his chest. He ducked around a side blow the incantation on the last line as he panted for breath. Kenpachi's Zanpakuto slammed into his own, forcing Ichigo into the ground before he suddenly disengaged and Ichigo was left slightly off balance. He saw the blade coming out of his peripheral vision and rolled to avoid the blow colliding with the ground with a grunt. He rose to his feet and turned to face the captain, who was already flying forward, BLD dripping from the gash across his chest. Ichigo let a small grin slip across his lips as he finished the Kido and cast the Shaka. It burst from his hands in a brilliant burst of crimson like a laser beam from an old horror movie, wailing and screaming as it collided with the captain's blade. The Kido drained away in a shower of red even as Ichigo was already behind the captain, Zangetsu humming in his hands as he brought his blade down. Kenpachi turned with a grin that was all teeth as he knocked Zangetsu aside and their blades clashed once more. The captain of the 11th was an untamed force of nature, brute strength and little skill with too much Reiatsu. It was a volatile cocktail just waiting to become a Molotov. Ichigo hissed as Kenpachi's Zanpakuto scored a line across his chest. The BLD was warm against his sweat. Chilled skin, and Ichigo didn't have time to dwell as he rolled underneath a low sweep and jabbed his blade at the captain's abdomen. His blade slid through skin and muscle with ease. The captain grinned, BLD staining his teeth as his fingers clasped around Zangetsu's blade and held it there even as his Zanpakuto rose into the air like a farmer's scythe before wheat. Zangetsu was cold with anger at the back of his mind as Ichigo dematerialized their blade and rolled away and onto his feet, his eyes flickering to the briefly surprised expression on the captain's face before, unfortunately, familiar BLD lust reappeared. Where was the man's spirit? A part of Ichigo knew that if he saw the captain's spirit, something would make sense in a way that he hadn't even realized he hadn't seen. Reiatsu built into the air towering between the two of them. Ichigo stared at the captain, his breath heavy in his lungs and on his lips, the wound on his chest burned and the BLD was cold and not quite dry. This was it, the final charge. The battle could probably go on for days. The captain was the kind of man to get back up, again and again, no matter how serious the wound, but Ichigo was much the same. He charged Zangetsu humming in his head, silent in the way that happened when they were one, when it was spirit, sword, and wielder together as Reiatsu roared around Ichigo, bright red tinged dark at the edges as he collided with the captain of the 11th. BLD flickered into the air as Zangetsu cleaved through muscle and bone, as he felt pain spear through his abdomen and a part of him wrenched itself together and apart all at once. Ichigo stood in a crater of wrecked pavement, BLD trailing down from the gash wrapping around his hip. It had missed his small intestines but had definitely clipped the large intestines and maybe his kidneys. His breath was too loud in his ears and Ichigo turned slowly to stare at the captain. He was a solid figure standing there facing Ichigo with a grin, and for one terrible moment, Ichigo wondered if the battle would continue, if they would slug it out till they were bloody and raw. The captain's mouth opened and he croaked a laugh, took a wobbly step forward and collapsed to the ground. Ichigo stared for a long moment, his chest shuddering with relief before the crimson spilling onto the pavement drew his eyes. Ichigo took a few shaky steps forward and collapsed beside the captain, idly pressing a hand to his own wound with a low halo of healing Kido around it. With a shaking hand, Ichigo ran a quick diagnostic Kido that he knew by heart and diagnosed that the wound had missed most of the important internal organs, but BLD loss would probably kill the man in 3 hours if he wasn't healed. It wasn't totally critical, but enough to make Ichigo worry. He had no idea what their medical staff was like here and how quick response time was. Yet he couldn't afford to heal the captain properly, not when there was the chance that as soon as he was healed, he would track down Ichigo and demand to fight again. Rolling his shoulders and hissing at the line of pain it brought, Ichigo decided to heal the captain just enough that he probably wouldn't die. The green glow of healing Kido hovered around his hand and the BLD spilling from the wound began to slow. Ichigo swayed for a moment, everything narrowing to his own wound and that of the captain's before his focus widened again and he could sense the little girl in front of him. When Ichigo opened his eyes, she was on the other side of the captain staring at Ichigo with wide eyes and a nervous smile that brightened like sunshine when she noticed Ichigo's gaze. He checked Kenpachi's body and gingerly pulled his hand away even as he checked on his own side and clumsily stumbled to his feet. "Thank for healing, Ken-chan, Beris-san. Ken-chan would love to play with you again," the little girl said in a bubbly voice, and before Ichigo's probably delirious eyes heaved the captain over her shoulder and bounded away. Ichigo stared for a long moment at the BLD on the pavement and wondered if it had been a dream before a gentle push from Osen helped him clear his thoughts. Right, he needed to find Yoruichi and the 13th Division. If he could find their Reiatsu, that would be enough. Casting out his Reiatsu, Ichigo felt Yuri, faint and far away. He closed his eyes and swayed for a moment on his feet before he gritted his teeth and sheathed Zangetsu. Turning on his heel, Ichigo stared at his torn shihakusho and the pale scar beneath with a sigh before he broke into Shuunpa. He was exhausted, but Rukia was being executed in 2 days and sleep wasn't an option. He just hoped everyone else had better luck than him. Ichigo was mostly certain he was in front of the right division. There was something picturesque about the building in the sunlight with pale walls and a splash of greenery shrouded around it. A Shinigami passed by the street Ichigo was sheltered in, and he tucked himself against the wall and pressed a hand idly against his closed wound, wary of being seen with the amount of BLD soaking his borrowed shihakusho. Most of it wasn't even his. He sucked in a breath and rubbed his hands once over his arms as if it could wash away the lingering traces of adrenaline, fearing for your life, and stress, and closed his eyes. Yuri was a steady presence humming inside the division amongst the bustle of Shinigami. Near him Ichigo could sense Tatsuki, Chad, and Orihime, maybe Ganju as well, but Ichigo wasn't too familiar with his Reiatsu presence yet. He opened his eyes and cocked his head to the side. Renji had stated that the captain of the 13th was apparently organizing some kind of rescue mission, but that failed to explain why Ichigo's friends were inside the division rather than waiting inconspicuously outside. Part of Ichigo was determined to vehemently believe it was a trap of some nature. That part of Ichigo sounded awfully like Benihime. Sighing, Ichigo listened to the steady hum of Osen's presence. Zangetsu was subdued, resting somewhere in the back of Ichigo's inner world, but when he tugged, he could feel his spirit respond with the equivalent of a lazy wave. He glanced up briefly at the sky and the sun hanging in the center of it and nodded, stepping out of the shadowed street corner and into the sunlight. Entering the division was easy. Ichigo rolled the sleeves of the 2 long shihakusho over one another until the BLD, which now looked like rust, was mostly hidden, and walked as if he knew where he was going. He didn't. But he did know where his friends were, and that was more than enough to manage as Ichigo sidestepped a Shinigami with a stack of paperwork that looked as if it might collapse any moment and bowed slightly as 2 Shinigami walked by, squabbling loudly with each other about the healing properties of various teas. Ichigo was uncertain how he managed such subterfuge with his hair color before he remembered Renji and concluded that perhaps Soul Society was far more different than the mortal world than it appeared at first glance. Or maybe it was just lacking any sense of logic whatsoever. Ichigo paused as he felt Yuri's Reiatsu spike slightly in the same way it always did when he noticed that Ichigo was in the vicinity. He wasn't sure if the spike was irritation or surprise because Yuri was unfairly good at hiding his emotions most of the time. Shaking away the errant thoughts, which he really couldn't afford to waste time on, Ichigo pushed through a door and entered an office knowing Yuri was somewhere behind it. Yuri was leaning beside the door with Chad on the other side of him. Tatsuki and Orihime were curled together on a couch that actually looked nice rather than the fancy stiff ones that no one actually liked to sit in. There was a man seated behind a desk with long white hair and something gaunt but kind to his features. He was also wearing a captain's hari. Silence descended with a swiftness akin to nuclear fallout and just as devastating. Ichigo wasn't certain if there had been a conversation before because the walls were rather thick, but it was there now, heavy and tangible like a weight on his shoulders as Yuri nodded his head once in the way that managed to convey, about time without words. Orihime on the couch grinned and waved, completely unaware of the tense atmosphere even as Tatsuki shot him a glare. Chad was silent and Ichigo didn't even need to look at his friend to understand the silent reassurance that they were all okay. His eyes drifted of their own accord once more to the captain seated at the desk. He was staring at Ichigo with wide eyes and he was pale, even paler than his already near colorless skin, if that was possible, and Ichigo couldn't get a read on what the expression exactly was, but it was sad. He looked away and waited for the awkward fresco to unfreeze so that they could move forward and he wouldn't feel quite like he was itching to crawl out of his own skin. "Is that BLD Kurosaki-kun?" Orihime asked in a suddenly concerned voice, and with that, the oppressive atmosphere was gone, only to be replaced by stifling concern as they all stared at the BLD on the white of his shihakusho. So that was why they wore black. Ichigo nodded, and before Orihime could stand and wrench apart his clothing in an attempt to heal him, he raised his hands and replied, "It's mostly not mine. I'm fine." "Kenpachi Taisho?" the white-haired captain asked with a tilt of his head as Ichigo carefully slid the door shut behind him with a click. He glanced up at the captain and saw something like empathy on his features and nodded carefully once as he replied, "Yeah, the lieutenant took him to the 4th. One eyebrow rose in careful surprise before the man shook his head slightly and with a smile that was more of a grimace replied, "I am Captain Jushiro Yukitake of the 13th Division, your friends have spoken much of you." "Ichigo Kurosaki, nice to meet you Yukitake Taisho," he replied with a short bow and heard Yuri snort, which was uncalled for. Ichigo could respect authority and be polite when the moment called for it. The captain nodded and sighed before turning to stare out through the shoji doors into a garden where Ichigo could hear the trickle of water and see the flush of greenery soft and inviting in the distance. Something nudged at the back of his mind, some piece of information that he was forgetting, that was important. "Where's Ganju?" Ichigo asked instead and waited for the information to come to him. Tatsuki shifted her arms where they were crossed over her chest and with a shake of her head replied, "He was here but he left with a member of the 4th Division Hana something." "Hanata Tatsuki." "Right Hanata, to go see the security for where Rukia's being held." "So, you know she's being held in the 1st Division for certain?" Ichigo responded as he shifted against the door and glanced at the captain who was obviously listening but appeared to be unaware of the conversation, merely admiring the pleasant sunlight. "Tricky." Tatsuki blinked and Yuri shifted his head to stare at Ichigo as he replied, "The word is she was being held in the Central 46 prisons." "That's where she was held before the trial apparently," Ichigo replied with a shrug and shifted on his feet before he tacked on, "That's what Rinji said and he got to see her." "Abare-san?" Yukitake-san questioned and Ichigo nodded even as he could see Yuri's incredulous gaze as he adjusted the glasses on the bridge of his nose and delicately questioned, "What happened to you while we were separated, Ichigo?" Ichigo glanced briefly at the captain who was still acting calm and peaceful as if Ichigo couldn't feel the power hiding beneath his skin. As if he wasn't one of the leaders of a military organization. Turning away from Yuri who would surely judge him even though he wasn't in control of his own fate, he quietly responded, "I fought 2 Shinigami from the 11th, then I met up with Rinji who's the lieutenant of the 6th, and then the captain of the 11th, and I fought after playing a way too scary game of hide and seek." The disbelief of his friends was almost like a comforting blanket, reminding Ichigo of the time he told them he had accidentally become the boss of a Yakuza gang or the time he accidentally became a TV show host for an episode on ghosts or something. Tatsuki snorted and shook her head as she broke the silence, "Only you Ichigo. We just had a few conversations and did some sneaking until Yukitake Taisho found us." "Yeah, you had a whole adventure Ichigo. That's so cool." Ichigo shook his head and frowned slightly at Oriheim's words, his fingers drifting towards where the hole in his abdomen had been as he responded lightly, "Probably not as cool as you think." When Ichigo glanced at the captain, he was frowning, staring at them all with an expression like his mom used to wear when Ichigo would talk to spirits or pretend to fight hollows. Like she was sad at something that Ichigo wouldn't understand. Frankly, he wasn't sure he understood now. "So, what are the chances of us being able to free Rukia from the 1st Division prison?" Ichigo questioned with a forced sense of calm as he tried to peel the seal off the thought that was poking at his mind. It was like it was staring him in the face. They all looked to the captain who steepled his fingers in front of him on the desk and with a frown much like a teacher before a failing student said, "Close to impossible. She is likely being kept in a type of cell that blocks Reiatsu completely, not to mention highly guarded. It's likely that our best shot at preventing Rukia's execution would be to do so during the execution. Kiriraku Taisho and I have secured a method to halt the Sokyoku, but a distraction would be necessary." Ichigo processed the words with a frown, taping his fingers against his wrist as he considered it. The captain was probably right that trying to break Rukia out from the 1st Division probably wouldn't work. It would also place them on Soul Society's radar. Right now for the most part they were anonymous, or at least everyone but Ichigo was. If we could halt Rukia's execution, it would probably force the person who organized everything to reveal themselves. Ichigo added softly, earning a few confused glances from his friends who were for the most part aware of Aizen and all that he entailed. Yukitake Taisho nodded, turning to glance out the window. He shook his head with something defeated to his posture and added, "If we can find out who organized this, Rukia's name will be cleared. If not, then you will need to take her to the mortal world. Soul Society is merciless even in its blindness." Ichigo shivered at the words, something bitter about them and ringing with truth as he nodded. Part of him was almost happy at the thought of Rukia returning to the mortal world with them, but the rest of him knew that Rukia belonged in Soul Society. She was a DMN good Shinigami, and she was proud to be one.
What are we expecting at the execution?
Yuri questioned as he pressed his shoulder slightly against Ichigo's. A nearly invisible touch that managed to convey how uncomfortable Yuri was being in the hostile territory of the literal enemies of his entire, now extinct, race. Ichigo felt it to a lesser extent. The execution will take place on Sokyoku Hill, aptly named for the Sokyoku. Before Orihime could ask, he explained, it has the strength of 1,000 Zanpakuto spirits, and when used the soul is completely destroyed. All the captains and the lieutenants of the Gotei 13 will be there. Something in Ichigo's chest clanged, like a metal gate slamming shut, because he hadn't realized that this execution meant Rukia's soul being destroyed forever. The thought of it was horrible in that way that settled like ice and slush in his veins so that he could barely pull himself out of his own mind. All of the captains and lieutenants, that doesn't sound very smart. Sounds like the perfect setting for a spectacle. Tatsuki replied to Yuri's comment, and Ichigo stared at the two of them with wide eyes for a long moment, because Aizen liked spectacles and the perfect opportunity. Ichigo glanced around Yuri at Chad, who was frowning, and when he noticed Ichigo's gaze, he nodded once in a way that was most reassuring. Ichigo glanced at the captain, who was frowning at his desk before he straightened in his seat and caught Ichigo's eyes. Oh, he probably knew about Aizen. That was cool. So, what kind of distraction were you thinking of, Yukitake-san? Ichigo questioned and pulled his mind away from what people in Soul Society knowing about Aizen meant. The captain jerked slightly and opened his mouth to speak, but was interrupted by a fit of coughs, the dry kind that got stuck in your throat and burned all the way through. Ichigo took a step forward, suddenly concerned about the captain, as he focused slightly on his Ryetsu surrounding his hands in the low hum of healing Kido in case anything went wrong. Yukitake-san's coughs died away a moment later, leaving a flush on his cheeks as he grappled almost blindly for a cup of tea that was probably cold and stale, and took a sip, wincing at the taste. He glanced up at Ichigo, saw the halo of Kido around his hands and maybe the unsure look on Ichigo's face, and said with a small smile, "Don't worry, I'm quite all right. But as to a distraction, we would need to keep the captains and lieutenants occupied, perhaps remove Rukia from the execution stand once the Sokyoku is released." Ichigo nodded, curling his fingers around the hilt of his Zanpakuto. He considered what his friends could do and what he knew roughly of the captains and lieutenants of Soul Society. Glancing to Yuri, he found a familiar reassurance there, a trust Yuri didn't easily give, and it was enough to force a plan. We have the element of surprise on our side at the moment. They don't know our goal, maybe they think we already accomplished it with Aizen's death. I'll handle Rukia and the Sokyoku. Yuri and Chad, I need you to create a diversion in one of the divisions, something big and flashy, probably in the 10th. Orihime and Tatsuki, please do the same with the 3rd division. The 6th division captain is Rukia's brother, so I'll handle him if necessary. Once the Sokyoku is taken down, we'll have a short window of opportunity to get Rukia away. I'll take the 2nd division. A deep baritone rang out from the doors to the garden, and Ichigo couldn't muffle a small smile as Yoruichi padded lazily through the door and jumped onto Yukitake Taisho's desk, grinning at the man. Yukitake Taisho blinked at Yoruichi for a long moment before he commented, "I should have known you were involved, Shihin-san." She nodded and turned to face Ichigo. Her fur was like the black expanse of space in the sunlight as she added, "It's a good plan, Ichigo, but you're all going to need some training. What we can manage to cram in." "You have a place, Yoruichi-san?" Orihime questioned with a tilt of her head. Yoruichi nodded, and Yukitake smiled slightly as he added wryly, "The perfect place for hiding." Yoruichi nodded once, and Ichigo felt there was a whole wealth of subtext there that probably had to do with the visit. She turned to stare at the 5 of them and said, "We should get moving as soon as possible. Yukitake Taisho can't host us forever." "What about Ganju?" Tatsuki questioned with a huff even as she rose from the couch and tugged Orihime up beside her. Yoruichi frowned and looked to Yukitake Taisho, who replied, "I'll send him along with Aburaiku within the next day or so. Knowing Aburaiku, he'll want to check in on you all." Ichigo nodded once and pushed off the wall, walking towards Yoruichi and Yukitake Taisho. He paused in front of the man's desk and bowed from his waist as he said, "Thank you for helping us, Yukitake Taisho. We will save Rukia." When Ichigo glanced up, the man's eyes were crinkled at the corners, sad like the way his dad got on the anniversary, and it lingered in the same area of his mind that was poking at him to remember. Yukitake smiled a watery smile and nodded as he replied, "I believe you shall." Yoruichi jumped off of the desk and padded out into the garden, beckoning them to follow her with a flick of her tail. Orihime waved to Yukitake Taisho and followed Tatsuki, who nodded once and was followed by a silent Chad and a silent Yuri, who was silent in a restrained manner different from Chad. A knock on the door echoed behind Ichigo as he stepped out into the garden and the sunlight. He realized duly that he had never seen Yukitake Taisho's Zanpakuto spirit. Interesting. He craned his head over his shoulder and saw a flowery kimono and a mess of curly hair before Yuri latched onto his sleeve and berated in a fond voice, "I know you're suffering from BLD loss and terminal idiocy, Ichigo, but we need to keep moving." Ichigo grinned at his friend and allowed himself to be pulled along behind Yoruichi as he responded, "Seems to run in the family." Yuri frowned and adjusted his glasses with a huff, tilting his nose up and not dignifying Ichigo with a response because he was above it or something. Ichigo just grinned and followed Yoruichi out into the streets of Serete. They had a plan. They would save Rukia. They wouldn't fail. They couldn't. Ichigo sunk into his inner world in between one disorienting moment and the next. It was like falling, like that moment at night when gravity reasserts itself suddenly and without warning and your soul literally jumps out of your skin for a moment. Ichigo blinked and slowly opened his eyes to the faint filter of sunlight across his cheeks, all glow and warmth, and the distant patter of rain. He paused and closed his eyes for a moment and basked in the feel of his inner world. It was just him and his Zanpakuto. For a moment, he could push away everything clawing at his throat. Rukia's execution, the captain's, Aizen, the Hogyoku, everything drifted and Ichigo could hear his own thoughts again. He could push away how much he missed home, the support system he had there. Kisuke and Tessai correcting his stance or providing advice or telling him about the time Kisuke accidentally insulted the emperor. The visit like a second family, always there for training when Ichigo felt like clawing out of his skin, or to just sit and listen to whatever inane gossip Lisa was peddling. His family. It stuck painfully in his chest how much he missed his family, Yuzu, Karen, and even his father. Ichigo had been away from them on the occasional trip, but this was so very different. It may have only been 3 days or a week, but there was no certainty that he would ever see them again, and it ate at him like the slow drip of an fall line. A foot lightly nudged against Ichigo's side, and by lightly Ichigo meant rough enough to tilt Ichigo onto his back and roll across the slick surface of the building below him. His eyes snapped open and he stared into Zangetsu's mismatched eyes, gold and brown, maybe blue, and the wide grin with too many teeth staring at him from above. Ichigo let his head thud back against the smooth concrete of the building beneath him and tilted his head back. In the distance he could see Osen, the representation of his Quincy powers, sitting on the edge of a skyscraper peering at the mess of greenery below as the rain fell in reverse. "So why are you going to listen to Yoruichi's advice?" Zangetsu questioned, and the words sat strangely in his spirit's mouth as if they were forced or tasted bitter, like he wasn't quite sure he actually wanted to say them. Ichigo rolled onto his side to stare at his spirit, who was sitting in a lotus position beside Ichigo, in the weird water pattern that the rain left on everything. The spirit's long white hair seemed like the long trail of a koi fish, too stark against the almost shihakusho the spirit was wearing. Ichigo considered Zangetsu's question. Yoruichi had plopped in front of him as he lay panting on the ground. Chad and Yuri, a mess of heaving breaths and the occasional pained nearby, stared into his eyes and asked if he was going to try and achieve Bankai. Bankai, the ultimate peak of power for a Shinigami, 100 times more powerful than Shikai. The very thought of it seemed daunting, like some indomitable cliff that Ichigo could only climb one-handed. He hadn't really considered Bankai. Sure, he had wondered what it would be like if it would be big and dramatic, or something subtle if he would get a new blade completely or an outfit change of some kind. But Ichigo had never really pushed the idea, never seriously considered it, because he had thought they had time. Bankai was something to fight with against a captain or an espada. Ichigo hadn't even encountered a lieutenant outside of the visit until he met Rukia. Maybe the real question, though, was whether he knew his soul enough for it, whether he was actually ready. Bankai wasn't like Resurrection or Volstaging. Those were power-ups and they involved knowing who you were, but Bankai was the relationship between the wielder and the blade, the moment when they became one. it was deeper than instinct or training. Ichigo was 15, how was he supposed to know utterly who he was? But he needed Bankai, right? In a day he was going to go up against the might of the Gotei 13, a military organization that had existed for a literal century, led by captains whose power level and training along with Bankai were probably near incalculable. Ichigo snorted as he recalled Kisuke's little journal full of the weaknesses of the Gotei 13. He could use that journal right now. No, technically if we did some twisting with all the power going on in your bloodstream, kiddo, we wouldn't even need Bankai. That would be inadvisable as Ichigo is unaware of all aspects of his powers and could cause a multitude of problems. Ichigo tilted his head to stare at Osun, who was drifting forward to stand beside their weird little triad. From Ichigo's perch on the ground, he could see underneath the semi-translucent yellow glasses the spirit liked to wear and the blue eyes hidden there. Zangetsu frowned, but it wasn't a deep frown, and Ichigo could almost feel the tug in his own spirit about what was best for Ichigo. He considered both of their words carefully. Zangetsu was probably correct. The thought was scary. Ever since Ichigo had begun training with Sken, the knowledge had sat somewhere at the back of his mind forcefully unacknowledged. Ichigo didn't want that kind of power, didn't want to consider what being the child of a Shinigami captain, a powerful Quincy with a hollow in his soul, meant he could do. He couldn't consider it. But Osun was also right. Ichigo hardly knew anything about his soul. He got confused when he even tried to figure how it all balanced out, because logically it really shouldn't have. He had been training his Quincy powers, and what hollow stuff he and Zangetsu could manifest from the weird spirit merge thing that had happened. Ichigo had understood about 1% of Kisuke's explanation when he finally achieved Shikai. Trying to combine all of that along with his Shinigami powers seemed like it could go horribly wrong. So Bankai? Ichigo let his head thunk dully against the concrete of the skyscraper beneath his head. It was all twisted up inside of him. Part of him wanted to achieve Bankai, wanted that connection with his Zanpakuto too, wanted to see how his power would manifest itself. Part of him knew he wasn't ready, that there wasn't really enough time, that maybe it wasn't necessary. A hand settled firmly on Ichigo's head and his eyes flicked open to stare into Zangetsu's mismatched eyes again. The spirit ruffled Ichigo's hair and leaned back as he said, "If you don't think you're ready, sometimes that's an indication you are. Other times it's you listening to YA heart. Personally, I think YA could unlock your Bankai if you wanted to, Ichi. But the question is, do YA think YA need to? What are you prepared to do to save Rukia? To protect your family? Wasn't that what it really boiled down to in the end, how far he would go to protect his family? It had always been about his family, ever since his mom had passed away, maybe before that, the first time he held his sisters. The truth was, if he wasn't strong enough, that he wouldn't be able to protect them. He had no idea what Aizen's plan was. The whole future was suspended in uncertainty like preserved amber waiting to shatter. But a part of Ichigo knew without a doubt that even if they saved Rukia, things weren't going to just calm down and return to normal. Soul Society knew about him. They didn't know the truth, but he was in their sight, and they didn't let powerful people walk away. You either died or joined them, or escaped, but that was an outlier. Ichigo rolled upwards into a seated position. All around him the rain fell in reverse, crawling towards grey overcast skies that threatened to burst. Ichigo wasn't certain why the rain fell that way. When he was sad it fell normally, but it always rained. Sometimes if the rain fell in the right direction for a long time, the greenery would become brown and dry like a desert. Maybe Ichigo needed to understand that. Yoruichi said she had a method that would allow me to gain Bankai in 3 days. Ichigo said quietly, letting his eyes drift to his two spirits. Osun was standing tall, his long black coat billowing in an invisible wind as he stared at Ichigo. Zangetsu was sitting with his head resting in his hands, but when he saw Ichigo's gaze, he dropped his arms and stared back. I don't have 3 days. It has to be without it. Just us. I think maybe I've been ready to try and have been afraid. But if I at least try, then regardless of the outcome I will save Rukia. YA better prepare for a hell of a training session, Ichi. Ichigo nodded, staring into the eyes of his Zanpakuto spirits. Maybe he wasn't ready, maybe that was the point. Regardless, Ichigo would succeed in what mattered. He didn't care for power, he just wanted to protect his friends, and if he needed power to do so, then he would gain it. Ichigo was pacing. He knew he was pacing, could feel the dust swirl around the edges of his Shirakusho. the grooves he had dug into. The strong packed earth, and Yoruichi's amused eyes as she coiled lazily against a wall with a mug of steaming tea in her hands. It was all mostly a front, her amusement and nonchalance, as if she had never even been to Soul Society before. But Ichigo had known Yoruichi for years, and he knew that even if her discomfort wasn't noticeable in her body language, that her worry and fear weren't noticeable in her voice, that they were still there. After all, tomorrow she would be facing her old lieutenant, one she had practically abandoned, and there was more to the story there that Ichigo didn't know and couldn't possibly ask, but he knew enough that it wouldn't be a happy reunion. Tomorrow. Ichigo ran a hand through his hair and tried to slow his breathing. He was nervous, the kind that settled in his stomach and made the ground shake, made the distance blur, and was all-consuming, so that even when Ichigo tried to pull his thoughts away it was pretty much a useless endeavor. It was totally logical to be nervous. But Ichigo didn't want to feel nervous. He knew in that vague philosophical sense that being nervous was good because it meant he was aware of the odds he was facing. But it still sucked. Ichigo sighed and paused. He felt sore all over, like his muscles were made of the taffy they fed into those machines, folded over and over again onto itself until it was one pliable mess. That was Ichigo. He was supposed to be resting, but Ichigo wasn't good at staying still, wasn't good at sitting there and letting the thoughts pile up on top of each other till it appeared to be Mount Fuji itself. Pacing probably wasn't a better option. Almost desperately, he wished the Wizard were there to drag him into debating some argument with Love and Rose, or for him to listen to Lisa talk about feminism, or have tea with Hachi and discuss how Kido actually worked. Usually Ichigo just nodded along and let the man figure out whatever problem he was talking through. He wanted to watch some cheesy drama with Mashiro and Kenshi, wanted to listen to Hiyuri and Shinji bicker. He wanted to be home helping his sisters with their homework, wanted to help his dad clean up the clinic and talk to him mostly casually about school and maybe what he was planning to do afterwards, or about his mom if it was a good day. He wanted to squabble with Rukia over the homework and the inventions of the modern world that totally made sense, thank you very much. He wanted to go patrolling with Yuri and Chad, maybe even Orihime and Tatsuki now, and fight low-level hollows without worrying about how much stronger they were, how he could die if he wasn't careful. He wanted to stop at Ashido's place and hand him a stack of comics and eat soup while listening to gossip from flaky magazines. Wanted to train with Kisuke until his arms were about to fall off and then be forced to heal both of them because Kisuke was a lazy BSTRD. Ichigo wanted to go home. And he wanted to save Rukia. It was his mission to save her, he had promised. If it had been anything but execution, maybe Ichigo would have trusted Soul Society to handle it. But he had promised to protect Rukia, so he would. She deserved it. She was kind, talented, smart, funny, and loyal. He couldn't let her become another cast-off piece, another victim of Aizen's plans. It just didn't help that Ichigo was 15. He was young, right? Most of the time he didn't feel that way, but when you were suddenly fighting against full-grown adults who were over a century old, it became apparent pretty quickly. He wasn't ready to die yet. Yoruichi's arms wrapped suddenly around Ichigo, a line of warmth because she always ran hot, and the familiar scent of jasmine and the aftertaste of electricity surrounded him. Ichigo tensed for a moment before he relaxed and buried his face in her shoulder. He felt something shaking and duly realized it was him. Ichigo sort of felt like an emotional mess, like everything inside him was shaking apart. Ichigo pulled away slightly a moment later to look at Yoruichi. She was frowning at him, but it was a gentle expression, and one of her hands carefully reached up to wipe away the tears on Ichigo's cheeks. He hadn't really realized he had been crying. The pain behind his eyes had melted into everything else. He felt like a kitten with its mother, and the sensation was strangely comforting as Ichigo let his head tip forward again and tightened his arms around Yoruichi. "It's going to be okay, Ichigo. You are young, but you are so talented already. The way you grow and just absorb everything like a sponge is amazing. Kisuke and I are always proud of you. Whenever you picked up something, we taught you, whether we wanted to or not. And you know what? I am, and I know Kisuke would be too, so proud of what you've done so far. You went up against a captain and kept your cool. You found your way through Soul Society, and tomorrow we're going to save Rukia, okay?" The words rushed over Ichigo, quiet like the wind through the trees, and more than Yoruichi usually spoke unless she was gushing about something. They settled something that had been pacing inside his chest, demanding his attention and ignoring rational thought for semi-rational thought. Ichigo nodded and let his fingers tighten in the silky fabric of Yoruichi's shirt for a moment before he pulled away and wiped at his eyes. Yoruichi smiled at him, and for a moment Ichigo could see her Zanpakuto spirit hovering like a star, like space, and the void curled into a lean figure that darted away in a burst of light. Yoruichi ruffled her hand through his hair and Ichigo scowled and pulled back carefully out of reach. "Come on, it's just about dinner time. Rinji should be arriving with Ganju, and Orihime hasn't touched the food, I promise," Yoruichi said with a teasing grin as she snatched his wrist and began to tug him to the part of the cave that was hollowed out sort of like a living quarters pavilion. Ichigo just nodded and silently thanked Kami that Orihime hadn't touched the food. She always came up with combinations that, while not entirely horrible, were generally unpalatable. His thoughts paused for a moment and Ichigo realized that maybe everything that made home was back in Karakura town, but Ichigo's friends were here, they were cooking dinner and commiserating over dinner. They had come even when Ichigo had mentioned how dangerous it could be. They had followed him because they knew Rukia, because they trusted Ichigo. Karakura was far away, but Ichigo still had his family. The first thing that hit Ichigo when they ducked beyond the outcropping of rocks that formed the wall was the smell of okonomiyaki. Ichigo tilted his head for a moment, pausing outside the threshold. A burst of laughter erupted and Ichigo plastered a grin that he mostly wasn't feeling onto his features and ventured inside. Yuri was dutifully tending to the pan where he was frying the okonomiyaki, glancing warily at Orihime, who was laughing at something Tatsuki had said before returning to the food. Tatsuki and Orihime were curled together on the mat as Tatsuki carefully braided Orihime's hair away from her face. Chad was also sitting, his fingers stroking gently over an old string instrument that Ichigo felt would be easier to find in a museum rather than an antique shop. The melody was something familiar, an American band that Chad and Ichigo liked. Ganju was on another mat, passed out with his bandana hanging lightly over his eyes. Resting against his shoulder was a small Shinigami who appeared pretty plain and kind of gave off the demure but kind vibe. It was probably Hanata, the 4th Division healer someone had mentioned. He wasn't quite certain why the Shinigami was here, but Ichigo wasn't going to raise a fuss. Rinji was leaning near the pan, staring at it with a dubious expression and crossed arms that made the tattoos there stand out in the weird light of the small cave. Yuri, ever observant, was the first to notice Ichigo. He nodded once in greeting and returned to the food with single-minded determination. If Ichigo recalled correctly, Yuri had taken food and nutrition at school. Chad was the next. He gently set down the instrument and looked at Ichigo once. His brow furrowed and Ichigo knew there was no hiding from his best friend anyway. The others noticed quickly after that, well, except for Ganju and the Shinigami, who were still asleep. Orihime's eyes widened and she looked a moment away from bouncing off the mat and tackling Ichigo until Tatsuki gently tugged on her hair and she deflated. Tatsuki waved a hand and shot him a look that Ichigo was refamiliarizing himself with. It was the stupid idiots that I need to protect from themselves look. Renji turned and caught Ichigo's eye, throwing him a casual smile that failed to hide the tight lines around his eyes and the way his Zanpakuto spirit paced uneasily across the floor. "Food's ready," Yuri said with the steadfast determination of one who was refusing to even think of politics until after dinner. Ichigo could get with that program. Chad carefully rose to his feet as Yoruichi slipped inside the cave and gently bumped her shoulder against his. Chad shook Ganju and Hanata awake as Yuri plated the food and Tatsuki finished tying Orihime's braids. For a moment, Ichigo hovered, uncertain what to do, until Yuri threw him a scathing look that practically screamed his name in the one tone of voice Yuri had mastered. Ichigo padded over and helped him distribute the food. Plopping down onto an occupied mat, Ichigo surveyed the room once more. There was a general hum of conversation as everyone ate the food. It was good and hot, greasy in all the right ways, and Ichigo kind of lost himself in the feeling of eating hot food for a moment. Slowly the food disappeared with compliments to the chef, who blushed and tilted his head in a brisk nod because Yuri was like that, and with it, the warm atmosphere drained away for something stifling, words, questions, thoughts, worries hovering on everyone's tongues. Rinji placed his plate down loudly and surveyed all of them for a long moment before he sighed and ran a hand through his hair, disrupting his bandana. He composed himself and began, "All right, so tomorrow is when the execution is scheduled. It's pretty early in the morning at 10 o'clock precisely. Something about after breakfast. Anyway, so far, the plan is as such. Ichigo will halt Rukia's execution until Yukitake Taisho and Kiraraku Taisho can destroy the Sokyoku. Before this happens, the rest of you will be splitting into groups to target divisions with captains that either aren't opposed to the whole thing or are collateral damage.
Does everyone know their positions?
Orihime and I are targeting the 9th Division. Chad and I will be targeting the 12th Division with the intent to cause extreme collateral damage with or without the presence of the captain. Hanata and I will be attempting to run interference for the 3rd Division. I'll handle the 2nd. Rinji nodded and continued, the plan is that once the Sokyoku is destroyed, Yukitake Taisho and Kiraraku Taisho will handle the Taisho. As far as we know, Unohana will remain neutral in the situation until she has been swayed. Confirm that Komamura, Sen, the Taisho, and Suafong are all in support of the execution. At the moment, Kuchika Taisho and Ichimaru Taisho are unknown. Kurosucha Taisho and Kenpachi Taisho will do whatever benefits them most, so be prepared to fight them as well. Hitsugaya Taisho has so far shown agreement towards halting the execution but has been distracted by the death of Aizen Taisho. Most of the lieutenants are staunchly against executing Rukia as they know her, but some will follow their captains. Their odds were pretty slim, Ichigo acknowledged as he mentally reviewed Rinji's words delivered in the same manner as a written report. Ichigo glanced around the weird irregular circle they had all formed. Everyone's faces were grim but still determined, and it stoked that fire inside Ichigo that believed perhaps even against the odds they could do it. They had to.
Any questions?
Rinji questioned, staring around at the circle of them with his hand resting lightly over the hilt of his Zanpakuto 2. In the background, Ichigo could see his spirit trying to eat the frying pan. Ichigo shook his head. He knew his role well enough: save Rukia and place her in safe arms, convince her PP of a brother if he decided to go along with the execution that was totally unacceptable, and get the hell out of there and wait for the dust to settle. It was a good plan. But rarely did a plan work out the way it was originally conceived as.
Where are we to meet up if everything goes south or the mission succeeds?
Tatsuki questioned with a raised hand, like they were still in school waiting for the clock to tick to the final marker so they could escape. Renji glanced to Yoruichi, who nodded and stepped into the center of the circle, planting her hands on her hips. She said, if everything goes south, head here, the same if the mission succeeds. Check your phones often but not at inopportune moments to see if there are any updates. This whole plan is quite unpredictable, so we need to be flexible. If you are captured by a captain, Kami, we pray not, do not panic. State you were given this task by the captain of the 2nd Division or the captain of the 12th, as technically you wouldn't be lying. We will rescue you or bargain for diplomatic immunity. If possible, try to escape on your own.
Anything else?
Rinji asked, staring at them all with an expression that fit a warrior who had seen countless battles. It was a strange countenance to the casual smile of earlier. They all shook their heads, and Rinji nodded once, scrubbed his hand over his face and said, I'm leaving now. I'm a lieutenant, at least for now. Good luck everyone, we won't let this execution happen. They repeated the normal parting words, but they were heavy with the weight of tomorrow, and Rinji twitched a smile and turned, disappearing in a burst of shoyunpa. Ichigo watched the spot where he had stood for a long moment. He wondered how tomorrow would change Soul Society. It would reveal where everyone stood ethically and who you could really trust. It might even reveal Aizen. Ichigo hoped he didn't somehow start a civil war. Something buzzed in Ichigo's pocket, and he turned slightly away from a yawning Orihime and Yuri working on his needlepoint to pull out his phone. There was a dent on the side that hadn't been there before, but Ichigo couldn't bring himself to care as he flipped it open and saw the line of a new message. It was from Kisuke. 2 photos sent as an attachment. The first was a picture of Yuzu and Karen asleep on the couch, obviously recent, with a scrawl of homework on the table, and Yuzu was wearing one of his sweaters. The second photo was of Ichigo and Rukia chilling at one of the local parks late at night after a patrol tossing around a tennis ball they had found. The lighting was strange, like something out of a dream, and Ichigo could remember almost vividly the chill of the night. After the sweat from the patrol and the way the air had tasted like rain. He saved the photos and tucked his phone carefully into his pocket as he turned back to his friends. Orihime was falling asleep on Tatsuki's shoulder, who looked disgruntled but was actually quite happy. Yuri was working on his needlepoint, leaning up against Chad, who was strumming the instrument once more. Ganju was talking animatedly to Hanata, and Yoruichi was in her cat form lounging by the warm coals. Ichigo knew what he was fighting for. X. He could see Rukia, see her short bob of black hair, her small stature, even the weak flicker of her Zanpakuto in the pale sunlight. She was in a white robe that was too pale and her head was tilted forward, drooped with shame or fear. Ichigo couldn't tell, but regardless her whole position screamed defeat, and it unsettled something in his chest. Defeat didn't suit Rukia. Ichigo wondered how anyone could look so calm when being marched to their own death, so resigned even as you knew you were innocent. There was something wrong about the whole thing to see Rukia so quiet, so almost lifeless. She should be defiant, she should be yelling or staring into the eyes of the Sutaisho and daring him to do it. But instead, she was like a ghost of herself drifting through her final moments. Ichigo instantly hated that. He wanted to see Rukia laugh again, wanted to see her smile or even her crappy drawings. This just lurched in his chest like he was plunging into swamp water and choking while he drowned. He couldn't let his last view of her be defeat, this resigned expression as if she deserved it. And he wouldn't. Ichigo's eyes flickered away from the large cross-like beam of wood that stood perched on the edge of the cliff and landed on the group of assembled captains. The 9th Division captain, one of Aizen's lackeys, was missing. Kenpachi was likely still in the 4th if he wasn't here. Suafong wasn't there, and Kurosuchi, who Ichigo was more than glad he hadn't encountered yet, was frowning at a device in his hands, and his lieutenant was gone. The captain of the 3rd was there, but his lieutenant wasn't. The Sutaisho stood at the front of the Gotei 13, imposing even from a distance. He couldn't see any of their Zanpakuto spirits, and Ichigo wondered if it was due to the distance or just how most of Soul Society handled their spirits. He frowned as his eyes searched for Ukitake Taisho's bright white hair but found only a small captain with short white hair. He wondered where they were. If they didn't show, then they had no way of destroying the Sokyoku, which meant Ichigo would have to hand Rukia off as fast as possible and deal with both the Sokyoku and all of the Shinigami, which would probably end badly. As his eyes surveyed the gathered captains once more, Ichigo spotted Renji, who was staring at a man with long black hair and silver jewelry in his hair. That was probably Rukia's brother. Ichigo's fingers tightened on Zangetsu's hilt as the Sutaisho walked forward and began to speak, likely stating Rukia's non-existent crimes deserving of execution for the world to hear. The whole situation rubbed Ichigo the wrong way. It was as if he could feel Aizen's strings wrapped around all of them and they were dancing helplessly to the melody he created. A wave of reassurance washed over Ichigo, and he mentally thanked his spirits as he watched Rukia be lifted into the air to rest against the cross of wood, not symbolic or pretentious at all. Unsheathing Zangetsu, Ichigo tucked away his Reiatsu, and as they unsealed the Sokyoku, Ichigo moved in a burst of Shuinpa. The Sokyoku was large and in the morning sunlight was like a forge, sparks of steel and embers burning blue all the way to yellow. It appeared like a bird, like a Feniand with an ear-splitting cry. It pulled back and swept through the air towards Rukia. Ichigo landed quietly on the wooden cross and glanced down at Rukia, who had her eyes closed and a blank expression on her face. "Come here often?" Ichigo questioned, casually staring as the Sokyoku began to draw closer, its large wings filling the air as it dove towards Rukia. She startled suddenly and violently as her eyes flicked open and she glanced up at Ichigo with wide eyes and a gaping mouth. "What are you doing here, you idiot? You could be killed." "So, could you?" Ichigo responded seriously to Rukia's furious exclamation and watched as the anger drained away from her features and left dull resignation. He was having none of that. Ichigo tightened his grip on Zangetsu's hilt and turned to stare the Sokyoku down as he said, "You deserve to live, Rukia. I don't know why the Central 46 convicted you, but they were wrong, so wrong. And I'm not going to let Soul Society execute one of my best friends. Live, Rukia." The Sokyoku collided with Zangetsu in a burst of heat and a force that felt like the sun itself had descended through the atmosphere. Ichigo scowled and pulled on his power, letting it surround him as he dug his heels in and pushed against the Sokyoku. He could hear the blade itself somewhere, hear this dull crash of screaming, incomprehensible and loud, as he gathered his Reiatsu and with a push let it go. It burst from Zangetsu in an arc of brilliant black that split the sky and forced the Sokyoku back where Ichigo could see Ukitake Taisho and Kiraraku Taisho. Ichigo glanced down at Rukia, trusting that the captains had it handled. Her mouth was open wide and there were tears brimming in her eyes as she stared up at him. Ichigo smiled and let Zangetsu cut carefully through the restraints binding her and gently caught her in his arms. When he glanced up, the Sokyoku was gone, a burst of fire and ashes filling the air and falling to the ground like snow.
I'm not going to let you die, Rukia. I made a promise.
Ichigo said, quietly tightening his arms around her as he searched for Renji, who was standing alert away from his captain near the base of the Sokyoku. The captains and lieutenants were staring up at Ichigo with shocked expressions, running around like chickens with their heads cut off. Rukia made a small noise and Ichigo glanced into her eyes as she frowned and weakly hit him on the arm with a fond, "Idiot." He grinned and knew she would hate him for this later as he called out, "Are you ready, Renji?" The lieutenant flashed a thumbs up and before anyone could prepare themselves, Ichigo lifted her above his head, ignored her squawking as she clued into his plan, and threw her towards Renji. Logically it made the most sense after all, he would waste precious time darting down and back up after all. Ichigo watched Renji catch her to Zangetsu's amused laughter as the lieutenant turned and disappeared in a burst of Shienpa before anyone could attempt to stop him. Ichigo grinned and stared down at the wooden beam beneath his feet. Public executions were horrible, the Sokyoku was destroyed, it didn't need to exist anymore. Ichigo raised Zangetsu above his head and with a surge of Reiatsu drove his blade into the wood, channeling his Reiatsu and destroyed it in a burst of light and energy as he dropped to the ground. As the dust cleared on the ruined remains of the Sokyoku stand, 3 lieutenants charged forward the Shikai bed. Ichigo darted forward in a burst of Shienpa. Yoruichi would be proud of slicing through their weak defense and incapacitating them in a fluid motion. If you couldn't afford honor, then you needed to be ruthless and fast, Benihime always told him that.
"Where are you taking the prisoner, Ryoka?"
A voice like lined steel asked as Ichigo whipped around and caught the owner of said voice's blade against Zangetsu. Ichigo peered through the mess of his hair into cold eyes, like a piece of metal in the dead of winter or in a cemetery, long black hair, noble features cut as clean as paper, and a strange silver hair piece. Rukia's brother, who Renji remained uncertain of, who maybe wanted to save his sister but also wanted to follow the law. Ichigo stared back into his eyes as their blades edged against one another. Vaguely in the background he was aware of the few captain that remained departing in a flurry of Shienpa, of the lieutenants being taken by Unohana Taisho, of Kiriraku Taisho and Yukatake Taisho leaving with the Su Taisho on their heels. But at the moment, all that mattered was that the Sokyoku was destroyed and Rukia was likely far away from Sokyoku Hill in Renji's capable hands. Somewhere safe. I made a promise to protect her, and I mean to uphold it. The captain blinked at Ichigo for a long moment before his blank expression twitched every so slightly, he only noticed because he's known Kisuke for so long, into a frown as the captain replied, "She has been sentenced to death by the Central 46, Soul Society's laws must be upheld. If it is for the sake of my pride, there is nothing I won't destroy."
"Do you even hear yourself?"
Her sentence was due to fraternizing with the enemy, yet they had no proof, nothing, they didn't even define said enemy.
Isn't that at all suspicious?
The law isn't infallible.
You're her brother, aren't you?
Brothers are supposed to protect their siblings. Ichigo bit back, incensed that someone could be so callous and apathetic about their own sister's execution. It didn't matter if she was adopted or married into the family, or an outcast, or distant. Older siblings protected the younger ones no matter what. The captain's eyes widened a fraction and something twisted in his expression as in the next moment his blade whipped out to the side in a blur of motion. Ichigo really wished that for once they could just talk things through, but no. Zangetsu hummed in Ichigo's hands as he ducked under the blade and in a burst of Shienpa appeared behind the captain, who turned and caught Zangetsu on his own blade. Sparks cut through the air as dust swirled around their feet and Ichigo strained against the taller man. They broke apart and the captain darted forward with his blade overhead. Ichigo caught the blade and began the incantation for Aikido in his mind as stepped back to put space between them and caught the captain's jab on the edge of Zangetsu's blade, sliding it wide and off to the side as he released the shaka. The captain flew back, the red Kido burning against his blade as he dug his feet into the strong packed earth. Ichigo carefully adjusted his grip on Zangetsu's sword and in a burst of Shienpa darted forward. A Byakurai sliced through the hair with a crackle of electricity. Zangetsu snapped up as Ichigo's instincts blared and the lightning crackled against their blade, shocks running through Ichigo's hands and up his arms as he whirled around.
You're well trained for a Ryoka.
the captain said as his blade slammed into Zangetsu's. Behind the man, Ichigo could see a flicker of his Zanpakuto spirit like an Oni or a ghost. Ichigo frowned, his expression twisted up in determination as he struggled against the captain's blade. "At least I know how to use that training for the right thing," Ichigo replied, and noticed the faint twitch of the captain's jaw. That much restraint couldn't be good for anyone. They broke apart in a spark of Rietsu, and everything felt like the moment before a storm break as they stared across the stretch of barren earth at one another. They collided once more, a rapid burst of movements as Ichigo dodged one blow, sliding underneath and to the next as he disappeared in a burst of Shunpa. The captain was fast and clinical, every movement was calculated, and already Ichigo could feel the strain in his arms as they clashed again and again. It was a whole different level to fighting Kenpachi and was more similar to fighting Rose or even Kisuke. Back and forth they moved like a dance, but fast, a blur of metal and shrieks of sparks. Offense to defense, Ichigo could barely keep track as Kido scorched the air and they clashed again and again. He rolled to his feet and ducked under another assault before retaliating, using his speed to dart into the captain's unprotected sides and back out again. The captain took whatever advantages he could find, and Ichigo hissed as he scored a gash on Ishigo's bicep even as he flickered a short distance away. His breathing was heavy and everything felt tight, like a spring an inch away from snapping. The captain's eyes narrowed as he stared at Ichigo for a long moment before he said, "You fight well, but the law must be upheld and you are in the way. Scatter Senbon Sakura." With a burst of Rietsu, the blade of the captain's Zanpakuto disappeared in a swirl of pink petals like the Sakura in spring. They filled the air, and with it, Ichigo could see the man's Zanpakuto spirit. The spirit wore what appeared to be samurai armor and had an Oni mask covering their features with tusks tilted into a frown. The Sakura was definitely not normal Sakura. Ichigo debated for a split second over whether to release his Shikai before Zangetsu's eager anticipation hummed in the back of his mind and the situation reasserted itself. Ichigo grasped the hilt of his blade and intoned carefully as Rietsu rose around him, "Tear the heavens asunder, Zangetsu." Rietsu cocooned Ichigo for a brief moment as the sealed blade split into the familiar form of his Shikai, two blades, one long with a hollow in the center and the other almost a knife, both black as a moonless night in his hands. It was familiar, and he could feel Zangetsu in each breath vibrating in his hands. The captain didn't wait for the dust of the hilt to clear as with a swipe of his hilt the pink Sakura swirled together and surged towards Ichigo. Ichigo could feel Zangetsu's battle lust as he crossed the two blades together in an X shape and vaguely noticed the captain's surprise as he released a Getsuga Jijish. The crossed crescents of black Rietsu filled the hill like the sudden drop of a sandstorm in a desert as they cut through the horde of pink Sakura surging towards Ichigo. One petal escaped and sliced through Ichigo's cheek, leaving a thin cut, and ascertaining Ichigo's theory about the petals, they were actually the captain's Zanpakuto blade. As the mass of Ichigo's Rietsu dispersed, it revealed the captain with a cut running across his chest, sluggishly dripping BLD as the petals of his blade hovered around him protectively. The captain and his spirit were staring at Ichigo with wide eyes, and the man frowned deeply as he swept his blade down, and the Sakura blade swirled together and swept forward once more with all the force of a tsunami. Ichigo darted away from where he was standing and towards the captain, watching as the petals followed his movement. Ichigo darted sharply to the left and with his larger blade turned and released a Getsuga Tensho in the captain's direction while pulling up a shield Kido Hachi had invented. The petals slammed uselessly against the shield before pulling back to hover around their wielder. Ichigo dropped the shield and stared at the captain, who stared back with once more a blank expression. Suddenly the petals surged forward, surrounding Ichigo in a cocoon of glowing pink, very sharp blades. Rietsu gathered around Zangetsu as the 1,000 tiny blades closed in on Ichigo. He closed his eyes and with a slow exhale released a Getsuga Jijish. Rietsu exploded from Zangetsu's blade, swallowing the sea of pink in a sky of black that was all-consuming. When the Rietsu faded away, the captain stood there with the petals of his blade hovering around him. His eyes were slanted as he dropped his blade and said, "Few have seen my Bankai, consider yourself honored to die by it. Senbon Sakura Kageoshi." The captain's blade sunk into the ground in a ripple of motion, and a line of blades appeared, stretching endlessly into the horizon and beyond, filling the space with the darkness and the glow of the blades. Ichigo would admit it was kind of cool. Then the giant blades broke apart into the tiny sakura petals once more, except this time there were more of them, filling the air like a plague of locusts drowning out everything else. Part of Ichigo kind of wished desperately that the captain had a normal Bankai instead of this. Already he could feel the strain in his muscles from a particularly good fight, and he knew that they weren't finished yet. He needed to save his reserves for whatever else happened. He needed to check in on everyone and make sure Rukia escaped safely. He couldn't afford to let the battle drag on. Rietsu swelled through the air as the captain stared down at Ichigo as if he was nothing more than an errant bug beneath his feet. The Sakura blades warped through the air and began to surge towards Ichigo. He crossed Zangetsu's blades one over the other, and as the blades began to surround him, he released the Getsuga Jijish. As the black Rietsu filled the air, Ichigo shot forward, moving through the heaty power of his Rietsu to crash his blade against the captain's as the Rietsu surged around them, and Ichigo drew on his blood vein to protect his body from his own Rietsu. The captain did the same with his Bankai, but it wasn't enough to protect him completely as Ichigo's Rietsu tore at his defenses and their blades clashed. In one moment and the next, Zangetsu's longer blade struggled against the captain's blade, and he drove his trench knife into the captain's abdomen in an area that wouldn't cause critical damage even with the multiple cuts and the large cut across his chest. The darkness of Ichigo's Rietsu faded away as the captain stumbled back. Ichigo could feel his own share of injuries in the sudden flu of adrenaline. There was a large cut wrapping around his hip, a hole through his thigh from a stray Byakurai, and over 100 cuts the size of paper cuts. The captain stared at Ichigo for a long moment with wide eyes, and Ichigo could almost see a fracture of emotion behind the cold grey as Ichigo said, "Rukia is your sister. It's an older brother's job to protect their sister. Honor doesn't matter, pride doesn't matter. If you can't protect your siblings, then you're dishonorable. Honor doesn't matter if your family is dead, if you're dead." Ichigo turned away knowing the captain wouldn't be able to retaliate. His hands were shaking and the rhythm of his heart felt weird in his chest as he glanced at Soul Society from the view of Sokyoku Hill. It spread out before him, a whole city, a whole country, the afterlife. They weren't done yet. Ichigo pulled out his phone and with a curse disappeared in a burst of Shunpa. Ishigo's head whipped from side to side as his eyes scoured the streets and the side streets as he moved in a slow blur of Shunpa. It wasn't made easier by the endless expanse of white stretching on all sides, rising like the moment before an avalanche threatening to consume Ichigo. It stuck somewhere in his chest, curling his fingers into a tight fist as he paused for a second on a street corner. His wounds were burning. He could feel the sticky trail of dried BLD on his abdomen every time he twisted his torso, and the 100 or so tiny nicks from the captain of the 6th Zanpakuto stung like a paper cut in lemon as sweat cooled along his spine. He felt out of sorts, still high on the adrenaline of battle and the euphoria of a plan going mostly successful, but also deeply concerned as the clock ticked by and he searched for Renji. Renji, who had sent a hurried message. When he got Ishigo's number, he had no idea about encountering trouble. And then nothing. If Ichigo concentrated, he could sense Renji, weak but there, and Ichigo was following his Rietsu like a flare in the night sky as he darted through the streets of Seirete. Because Renji and Rukia should be in the training base, they shouldn't still be in Seirete, in the streets of the Gotei 13, and if they were, it could only mean trouble. Trouble was the absolute worst thing they could have right now, with a plan balancing on a tightrope. Ichigo leaned carefully against a wall of white mortar with a pale sliver of shadow and wiped away the sweat cooling on his brow. If he closed his eyes, he could still feel the battle, could feel Zangetsu's energy brewing beneath his skin, like chugging too many energy drinks after 3 hours of sleep. Osen settled like a wave of calm over Ishigo's shoulders, and when he opened his eyes, he could see the older spirit hovering protectively in front of Ichigo. Osen carefully shifted Ishigo's Shirakusho and brushed his hair out of his eyes with a knowing look from beneath the pale yellow of his glasses. Healing. He could do that. Should probably do that. But Ichigo couldn't waste the time when he needed to find Renji. Couldn't waste the time he was already wasting. Ichigo flashed the older spirit a weak smile and pushed off of the wall with a force of will that was by no means small. Tilting his head, Ichigo concentrated and in a burst of Rietsu moved forward in a flash of Shunpa. Ichigo moved through the streets in a blur, following the thin pulse of Renji's Rietsu and searching for a shock of 2 bright red as he rolled around a corner and crossed over a rooftop. It was strong in the endless white of the streets and the sensation of a clock ticking above his head. Ichigo almost missed Renji as he passed a small side street that led into an area with a small clearing and 2 other side streets. Ichigo was ready to keep moving, to explore another street or roundabout, but something in his chest tugged and Ichigo paused just for a moment and stared. The black shadow on the ground was enough to drive Ichigo's feet forward as he moved through the street and into the clearing. Renji was sprawled on the ground, his face pressed into the laid stonework with a growing pool of BLD trailing across the pavement. Ichigo couldn't move his eyes away from the BLD for a long moment, something about its smooth crawl and the pale bricks beneath it sunk into Ichigo like a hook. Then Renji groaned, low and pained, and Ichigo snapped forward, tugging on his Reiatsu and beginning to shroud his hands in the familiarly prickly feel of healing Kido. Ichigo gently rolled Renji onto his back, carefully feeling for a spine injury as he completed the motion and surveyed the damage. There was a puncture wound in his abdomen, close to a lung and maybe hitting his ribs, but probably not puncturing his lungs on the right side near his heart. Pressing his fingers carefully against Renji's pulse point, Ichigo felt the weak flutter and cast a quick diagnostic as his other hand put pressure on the wound. The BLD coated Ichigo's fingers and he bit his lip and held back a grimace. It was just BLD. As he read the diagnosis, he had been correct: no punctured lungs, which was more than great. But a few broken ribs and a lot of BLD loss happening too quickly. Taking a deep breath, Ichigo pressed both hands over the wound and began the slow process of healing Renji's wounds. It was delicate work, starting with the bone and making sure there were no fragments, healing hairline fractures and then moving to the soft tissues and cartilage. Kisuke said Ichigo's method of healing was different from how Shinigami normally healed. They used the body's Reiatsu to heal at an accelerated rate. But because Ichigo knew biology, 20th century biology too, he knew how to pinpoint healing in a way that was different. Or at least that was Kisuke's theory. Ichigo wasn't quite certain he was doing anything differently. Ichigo pulled back slightly as he finished, working on encouraging the red BLD cells to multiply and for the water in Renji's body to join in the creation of BLD. The wound, which had previously been a jagged puncture, was an inflamed scar rising vividly against the pale flesh and black lines of Renji's tattoos. His eyes searched their surroundings, only dully recognizing that Rukia was gone, had probably never been there in the first place. A part of him sunk, like being plunged into icy water, because the whole point of this was to save her, and she was gone. He wanted to get mad at Renji, but couldn't, not yet, not until they knew where she was and if any of it was salvageable. Renji groaned and Ichigo blinked, forcing his thoughts back onto his patient. He carefully finished the healing and let the Kido fade away, prodding at the area gently with his fingers to feel if there were any malformations or odd lumps. Renji groaned again, and his eyes flickered weakly open to stare sightlessly at the blue sky above. Ichigo sucked in a breath and gently prodded the area, once more earning a hiss from Renji and the slow drag of his eyes onto Ichigo. The lieutenant sat up suddenly. Or tried to. Ichigo placed a supportive hand against Renji's back and helped him to sit up, holding his other hand up in the universal sign of wait, and let Renji catch his breath. Ichigo kind of wished he had a water bottle to offer him, but he made do with letting Renji breathe for a moment and prod at his new scar with a grimace. Renji said in a stuttered exhale as he dragged a hand across his face and tipped his head forward. Ichigo moved his hand in slow circular motions on Renji's back and waited even as impatience jittered like a drag through his body. Renji reached blindly for his Zanpakuto, and when he had found the hilt, he curled his hands over the blade on his lap. He looked up at Ichigo and without prompting began, "I was close," and then Captain Sen appeared and he moved so fast I barely saw him. I knew he was all for justice or whatever, but I wasn't sure what to do, and then there was a sword in my chest and he had Rukia. Ichigo cursed and paused before dragging a hand over his face or through his hair, staring at the BLD there for a long moment before he wiped it off on the side of his Shirakusho. Sen was probably working on Aizen's orders, which could only mean one thing. Rukia's was with Aizen, which only spelt out a recipe for disaster. Renji stiffened beside Ichigo and he glanced up to watch a black butterfly float gracefully through the air before landing daintily on Renji's palm. Ichigo was pretty certain they were used for communication by the Shinigami, which was weird but alright, and his suspicion was confirmed as a female voice that sounded vaguely familiar began to speak. Ichigo stopped listening after the first sentence because the sound of something like white noise, like when the channel stopped working, filtered through his head, loud and drowning. Because Unohana, captain of the 4th Division, had just exposed Aizen as the traitor he was. Which was great. Objectively. Because Ichigo knew it as easy as breathing, that if Aizen hadn't wanted to be exposed then he wouldn't be. If he wanted to remain in the shadows then that's where he would be. This reveal. This meant he was ready to move on with his plans. He didn't need Soul Society anymore, he just needed the Hogyoku. He closed his eyes for a long moment, felt the brush of Zangetsu's conscience against his own, a wave of reassurance and will, and a reminder of what they were here for. Rukia. Ichigo opened his eyes and saw Renji staring at the black butterfly with a frown, one that highlighted the lines on his forehead and the darkness of the tattoos there. He looked up into Ichigo's eyes, and he could see there a storm of turbulent emotions built on a history and society that Ichigo didn't quite understand. But he understood enough. "Let's go save Rukia," Ichigo said, the words sharp and heavy, too heavy for the seemingly pleasant afternoon, as he rose to his feet and extended his hand. Renji stared for a long moment at Ichigo's hand, stared beyond it and at Ichigo, and he didn't know what the lieutenant was thinking, but all that mattered was the grasp of Renji's hand in his own and the determined, "Yeah." Renji swayed once on his feet before he steadied himself, and Ichigo nodded once. Some part of him itched at allowing a patient to fight and move so soon after an injury that could have been critical, but he couldn't afford to be overbearing or to be hypocritical and heal his own wounds. Ichigo reached out, searched for the familiar imprint of Rukia's Reiatsu across the too broad expanse of Soul Society. It was branded onto his soul, something he could find in his sleep, the same for any of his friends, and it should have been easy to find, but it was like peering through a film of bubble wrap. Aizen. That was the only answer. Ichigo's fingers curled to a fist and he cursed at the sudden roadblock. They needed to find Rukia before Aizen could enact whatever plan he had that involved her. Where would he have taken her? The most logical decision would have been some secret base with Reiatsu suppression walls and appropriate scientific machinery. But Aizen wasn't always logical, he was theatrical. He wanted to be recognized for his plots, for his plans. He needed an audience to perform to. And with the reveal? He had one, the perfect one. So, he needed a place that was easily accessible. And he probably had an escape route too. But easily accessible. Showy. Dramatic. They're at Sokyoku Hill. Ichigo said out loud, and the words felt right. Renji startled next to Ichigo, but only for a moment before he nodded. Ichigo repeated the motion and disappeared in a burst of Shienpa, pulling out all the lessons Yoruichi had tried to cram into his head over the years as he headed back towards the execution hill. He could feel Renji a fair bit behind him as he moved, and part of Ichigo was tempted to pull out his phone and text his friends, ask them for help. But Aizen was dangerous, so instead, he sent a quick text to Yoruichi and paused on the eve of a roof to hit send, his heart hammering in his chest. Taking a deep breath, Ichigo leapt forward and let his fingers tighten around Zangetsu's hilt. Clouds of dust billowed around the hem of Ichigo's Shihakusho as he landed on the hill. His fingers were tight around Zangetsu's hilt as his eyes swept around. The shriek of metal was loud and jarring as the dust cleared and Ichigo could see Kuchikitaisho fighting Tsen. Their swords clashed in a blur of silver and Ichigo dragged his eyes away from the fight and to Aizen, who had Rukia crumpled by his feet. With a burst of Reiatsu, Ichigo darted forward towards Aizen, who was grinning at Ichigo. Well, it wasn't exactly a grin, it was more the variety of extremely unsettling smile. Their swords clashed with a hail of sparks that tore at the wind around them as Ichigo struggled against Aizen's greater strength. He was almost certain that the man wasn't using his Shikai and instead was wielding his sealed blade, but a part of Ichigo was tense at the mere thought of what the illusion-type Zanpakuto could accomplish, had already accomplished. Another part of him knew that Ichigo wasn't a match for Aizen, not really. He just needed to hold on until more captains arrived, and maybe flare his Reiatsu a bit. "Ichigo Kurosaki, I was wondering when you would show up," Aizen stated casually as their blades skittered against each other and Ichigo widened his stance, peripherally aware of Renji's arrival on the hill and the lieutenant joining Kuchikitaisho. Ichigo frowned at Aizen and refused to respond, the man was a MSTR manipulator and talking was like asking for a slow-acting poison. The man's expression didn't even twitch at the lack of response as he fluidly reversed his blade and Ichigo was forced onto the defense, countering an overhead swing and following through with a sharp jab. Ichigo struggled against the sudden onslaught of attacks. There was barely a moment to catch his breath or to release his Shikai as his mind viciously tried to see where Aizen would attempt to attack next, all while trying to figure out a weakness. Ichigo pushed back, tugging on Zangetsu's strength as he released a ruthless combo Ashido had taught him and then Shinji had added to, flowing from one movement to the next, temporarily pushing Aizen back as their Reiatsu rose and clouds of dust billowed at their feet. "You've become quite skilled, Ichigo. Of course, it won't be enough to stop me." With a surge of Reiatsu, Aizen pushed back, his blade heavy and sure in his hands. Aizen was all economical movement, nothing was wasted and everything was calculated. Ichigo could barely keep up, his heart hammering in his chest and all the way to his hands as they shook and the wound in his abdomen twanged and pulled. Aizen noticed and heavily pushed on that side, forcing Ichigo back across the packed dry earth with a dull clang of Renji and Kuchikitaisho somewhere in the back of his mind. Aizen jabbed the pommel of his Zanpakuto against Ichigo's abdomen, knocking the breath from his lungs in one harsh moment and twisting Zangetsu from his hands in the next. Ichigo unconsciously dematerialized the blade even as he stared up at Aizen's own blade flashing towards Ichigo in a strike that wouldn't kill him but would definitely be critical. The moment seemed to move in slow motion, like everything was being dragged through a thick layer of honey, and Ichigo's arms felt laboriously heavy even as he remembered Kisuke's advice about injuries and fighting. Better to lose the use of a limb temporarily than to lose the fight. The Zanpakuto bit into his palm as his fingers wrapped around the too cold metal, and in his left hand, he materialized Zangetsu, ignoring the pain as the metal of Aizen's Zanpakuto cut to the bone and BLD leaked around the blade and dripped to the dry dust below. With one harsh push, Ichigo swung Zangetsu, taking a moment to absorb the shock on Aizen's features before the man sprang back, his blade slicing further through Ichigo's hand as his fingers unclenched and Zangetsu sliced through thin air. Aizen stared at Ichigo with narrowed eyes for a long moment before he straightened and stroked a hand leisurely through his hair as he stated, "You have no concept of what I am trying to accomplish, Ichigo. I shall create a new race of Shinigami, of Hollow, that shall transcend the boundaries of nature itself. I will destroy the corrupt soul society and create a society that is accepting, one that is flawless. What will it cost? The death of 1,000 innocents? The loss of your own morals? The destruction of the balance of the three realms?" Ichigo questioned across the rough pants of his breath and the pain pulsing in his hands and through his body like a blaring warning symbol. Aizen paused and stared at Ichigo for a long moment. He could hear the dull roar of fighting in the background, the clash and shriek of swords, and the approaching presence of the captains, some who were only a minute away. Aizen moved fast, Ichigo could only barely see him, instincts moving his arm and by extension Zangetsu too slow to stop the slice of Aizen's Zanpakuto against Ichigo's stomach. It wasn't deep, but it was accompanied by a burst of Reiatsu and pain that sent him sprawling back across the strong dust. Ichigo rolled to a rough stop, his breath was too loud in his head and everything else was quiet, but for the pulse of the wound in his hand, the puncture in his abdomen, the gash across his stomach, and the other cuts littering his body. He gasped out a harsh breath with a taste of BLD on his tongue and pressed a hand against the wound, trying to channeling healing Kido but failing miserably in the disorienting spin of the world around him. Ichigo rose shakily to his knees, his eye sweeping across the battlefield. Kuchikitaisho was unconscious on the ground, Renji was beside him, not moving but not on the ground. The wolf captain was fighting Sen along with a Shinigami with cut sleeves. Yoruichi and who was probably Suafong were attacking Aizen, who was fending the two of them off with ease and nonchalance. He could see Rukia, sprawled unconscious in that white robe that Ichigo kind of hated. A wave of Reiatsu rushed like cool water over Ichigo. He could feel Zangetsu's anger simmering at the background, but also his support and Osen's measured calm, that also covered anger. Taking in a deep breath, Ichigo rose carefully to his feet. A line of cool steel pressed against Ichigo's neck. He tensed and then forced himself to trying to name the almost familiar Reiatsu pressing against Ichigo's back. "I wouldn't do that if I were YA kiddo. Best wait this one out. I like YA, have a real chance of stopping the boss." Ichigo knew the Reiatsu, knew it from the endless expanse of dust, from the cold and endless night. He didn't turn his head, but he knew well enough who was behind him. Ichimaru Taisho, an unknown, cunning, a prodigy, and apparently out for Aizen's BLD even as he worked with him. Ichigo shifted his head in the barest hint of a nod, and the captain behind him made a humming sound and moved his Zanpakuto away just the slightest measure, but it allowed Ichigo to breathe easier. He was helpless to watch as Aizen turned to Rukia. Yoruichi and Suafong sprawled on the ground. The wolf captain was also on the ground, and the air felt stilted and expectant as Aizen boasted about searching the archives and Kisuke's old research for a device that would allow him to retrieve something from a soul. It crawled across his arm like the plates of a dinosaur or the crocodiles he had seen at the zoo, grey and dull as he held Rukia aloft. In the pale light of the afternoon, the white of her robe seemed too bright, like she was something holy about to be sacrificed by this figure in black. Ichigo tensed, every muscle in his body screaming at him to move forward, to save Rukia. He could feel his eyes burning with unshed tears, and the cold press of metal against his throat. A scream lodged itself in his throat as Aizen plunged his hand into Rukia's chest. It sunk into her chest, like water, and her eyes opened, dull and yet screaming as Aizen smiled, that vacant unsetting smile. With a tug Aizen pulled something from Rukia's chest. It wasn't the Hogyoku that much Ichigo could tell by feel alone, but Aizen couldn't. The man grinned and dropped Rukia's body, and Ichigo couldn't see if her chest was rising from this distance, couldn't feel her pulse and know if she was alive. The other captains were there. Ichigo wasn't sure if they had been there before his vision tunneled in on Rukia, but they were there staring at Aizen with wide eyes and Zanpakuto glinting in the sunlight. The blade resting against his neck dropped and, in a voice, barely above a whisper, Ichimaru said, "Be careful, kiddo." With a burst of Shiampa, the presence behind Ichigo disappeared and Ichigo watched Ichimaru reappear by Aizen's side along with Sen. His white hair glinted in the pale sunlight along with his wide grin, and he wondered whose side the man was truly on. One of the captains darted forward, their Zanpakuto held aloft only for a burst of Reiatsu to flood the hill, sweeping up a cover of dust as a crack split the sky open. Ichigo recognized those cracks in the sky. Bone-white faces peered from a vast uncompromising darkness as beams translucent and yellow like Osen's glasses surrounded Aizen and the two other rogue Shinigami. Aizen's eyes roved across the gathered Shinigami with a grin that twisted at the edges as he tucked away his glasses, and when his eyes found Ichigo's, there was a promise there. The Garganta snapped shut with a loud pop that seemed to echo and hang over Soul Society. Ichigo couldn't bring himself to care in the awkward and heavy silence as he lumbered forward, every step heavy with the cool wash of BLD on his stomach as he collapsed beside Rukia. With a shaking hand, he placed his fingers over her pulse and felt the weak flutter there. Ichigo couldn't stop the swell of relief in his chest as his shoulders drooped and he could feel the ache of his body and the shaking of his fingers. Footsteps approached from behind and Ichigo turned slightly, fingers grasped weakly around Zangetsu, prepared to fight if he had to. The Sutaisho stood with Unohana beside him staring down at Ichigo with contemplative eyes. The sun backed their silhouettes and everything hung tense on Ichigo's shoulders, like the executioner's axe. The old man nodded once after a long moment and stated, "Kuchiki Rukia has been absolved of all crimes placed by the Central 46. Ichigo nodded in a half-bow as Yoruichi appeared beside him. Everything felt heavy around the edges of his vision, and the BLD felt sticky in the crease of his palm. Before Ichigo could turn to Yoruichi, the darkness swept over him suddenly and like a tide, and all he felt was the cold press of darkness. Everything felt sore and too fuzzy, too warm, like the stifling heat of a blanket in the early morning. Ichigo floated, everything distant and numb in that weird space of almost conscious, and he could feel it there, almost tantalizing as the rhythm of the darkness surrounding him hummed. Ichigo shifted, pulled at the muscles in his arms, twitched his fingers against the sheets beneath his hand. They were worn but soft and cool against his skin. They weren't the sheets of his bedroom or the ones Kisuke had on the bed he sometimes let Ichigo sleep in. Ichigo blinked or tried to, but his eyes felt heavy and his whole body felt as if it had been pressed into the ground flat like a cartoon character. He saw his muscles protesting the vigorous training and fighting of the past few days. Right. The fighting. Ichigo stiffened slightly as the events of the past few days flooded his mind in stark relief, and he recalled the almost execution and Aizen. Rukia, who had been pardoned by the Sutaisho, who wouldn't be executed. he slumped against the worn sheets and focused on his breathing and the hum of the space around him. He could hear the rustling intake of someone breathing nearby, the quiet kind that more often than not meant sleep. Beyond that, there was the distant sound of footsteps, the creak of floorboards, and a metallic sound that Ichigo knew was familiar but couldn't place. Ichigo blinked and forced his eyes open. They felt dry and gritty, the same as his mouth, as if something had crawled through his sinuses and died. He was in an unfamiliar room with the pale cream walls, a door to the left, and a seat and a tray on the right. Ichigo tilted his head slightly and blinked through the blurry film over his eyes until he could make out the vague shape of Chad in the chair, asleep with his head tilted down and resting against his chest. He looked okay, perfectly fine even, and it eased something tight in Ichigo's chest as he glanced around the room. Ichigo closed his eyes and let his focus drive inward until he could feel the worried press of Zangetsu's Reiatsu and the quiet reassurance of Osen. His Reiatsu was depleted, but not enough that he wouldn't be able to fight if it was necessary. Ichigo doubted it would be. He hadn't seen any cameras or cuffs of any kind. The door probably wasn't even locked. It was far more likely that Ichigo was in the 4th division. A knock on the door disturbed the lingering silence, and Ichigo opened his eyes and shifted vaguely upwards on the gurney he was resting on. A moment later the door slid open with the familiar click, and Ichigo stared at the Shinigami behind the door. She had long black hair tied in a braid in front of her chest, a captain's hari, and a kind enough face with a pleasant smile. There was also a vague terrifying aura of bloodlust that was easy to dismiss. "Ah, Kurosaki-san, you're awake. Uno Hana Taisho." Ichigo responded with a half-bow that made something in his chest twist with pain. He grimaced and mustered a pleasant smile for the captain, whose sharp eyes had already noticed, and was walking closer to stand at the side of the bed. "How are you feeling? Any pain?" she questioned as she looked over a clipboard with a few sheets of paper stuck to it. Ichigo was tempted to shrug and say something minimal, but knew better and did a quick self-assessment. Ichigo could tell his wounds were healed, but the residual soreness in his body was likely more related to the continuous fighting. He looked up at the captain, who was smiling blankly down at him with an expression that was almost vacant. "No, just sore. As to be expected, you overtaxed yourself quite a bit, Kurosaki-san." There was a lot insinuation in that sentence, and Ichigo let his eyes fall to the sheets covering his legs as he considered the captain's words. He had stopped the Sokyoku, fought Kuchiki Taisho, healed Rinji, and then fought Aizen. It was maybe a lot for one person to handle. "Did I go into shock?" Ichigo questioned, but felt as if he already knew the answer. Uno Hana Taisho finished marking something on her clipboard and glanced at Ichigo with a sharp nod before she returned her attention to the sheet and marked something else. Ichigo rubbed his fingers over the soft sheet, unsure of how to progress or what to say, even what to ask, and feeling slightly awkward in the presence of a captain. "You are quite a talented healer, Kurosaki-san. Who taught you, if you don't mind me asking?" "Thank you, Uno Hana Taisho. I was taught by Tessai Tsubaki and my father," Ichigo replied, and couldn't help the slight blush that burned across his cheeks, because Uno Hana Taisho, no matter the institution she worked for, had always been a childhood idol for Ichigo ever since Kisuke had mentioned her expertise in healing. Uno Hana Taisho smiled pleasantly and nodded as she tucked her clipboard against her side and rested her undivided attention on Ichigo. It was frankly terrifying. "I would recommend bed rest for the rest of today to allow your body to replenish its reserves, and tomorrow you may be permitted to leave the 4th. The words were said in a pleasant tone of voice and with a small smile, but behind it hid the familiar threat of a healer attempting to care for their patient. Ichigo had used the same aura before in a vain effort to keep Shinji from tearing his stitches. Ichigo nodded his head once, and Uno Hana smiled, satisfied by his response. She curled her fingers into her sleeves and stated, "You are allowed visitors during visiting hours. Please refrain from causing mayhem while in the 4th, Kurosaki-san." Ichigo smiled in thanks and tried to encapsulate how grateful he was for her care. The captain nodded and turned, walking silently across the floor. She paused at the door and added, "Oh, when you are healed, feel free to visit the 4th anytime, Kurosaki-san. We could always use a healer of your talent." Then the captain was gone and the door slid shut with a click. Ichigo tried not to scream internally, but it didn't really work out. Unohana had asked him to visit the fourth, which was kind of crazy, and Ashido would never believe him, and Ichigo couldn't really wrap his mind around it either. Chad shifted in the uncomfortable chair, the kind that all medical places had, and his head dipped for a moment before he straightened and opening his eyes. Chad blinked once, slow and heavy, the gold coin on his chest bright against the darkness of his skin, as his eyes slid over to Ichigo and an easy smile crossed his friend's lips. In one smooth motion, Chad was on his feet and beside the gurney, his presence a solid warmth that settled something in Ichigo's chest about being in this strange place, with strange people and strange laws. "Is everyone okay?" Ichigo questioned, recalling vaguely that none of them had been at the hill, which Ichigo could only be thankful for considering what Aizen could do. Chad nodded and settled silently on the edge of the bed, staring past Ichigo's head at the wall behind him for a moment before his eyes connected with Ichigo's and he understood. They were all safe, but they weren't quite in the clear yet. It was better to be cautious. The door slid open with a loud click, shattering the peaceful silence of the room as Chad nodded once and returned to his seat. Orihime was the first to enter the room, bouncing on the ball of her feet in her normal clothing with a smile that seemed to brighten the room all on its own. Tatsuki followed behind Orihime with her arms crossed over her chest and a frown on her lips that was trying strong to hide a smile. Yuri followed last and slid the door shut with a roll of his eyes as he stalked over to lean against a wall. "Ichigo, they told us you were awake. We were all so worried because you were like Bam. And then you were fighting all these captains and saving Rukia, and there were explosions. Oh, and there was a betrayal plot like a TV show." Orihime said in a rush that left no space for breathing as her hands flapped in the air and she beamed at Ichigo with all the force of the sun. Ichigo nodded, the only appropriate response to Orihime's energy, and watched as Tatsuki settled a hand on Orihime's shoulder and guided her to a chair. "How are you feeling, idiot?" Tatsuki asked with a frown that couldn't quite muffle the concern in her voice and the way her hands were clenched into fists as she crossed her arms over her chest. Ichigo shrugged and scratched at the back of his head before responding, "Sore, I guess." "You should have called us, we could have helped Ichigo," Tatsuki stated, staring at him with narrowed eyes, and suddenly Ichigo could feel the attention of the room like an iron rod in the forge glowing bright red and hot. Ichigo's eyes dropped for a moment as he let his fingers trail over the sheets. The truth was always the best answer. "I didn't want you all to get hurt. I know you all are capable fighters, that you're strong, and I would trust you have to my back any day. But Aizen is dangerous on a whole different level, and with all the other captains involved I didn't want you to get hurt." Tatsuki was still frowning, but she settled slightly with a roll of her eyes against the wall. Orihime nodded with a pout as her lips quirked to one side and she stared at her hands. Chad was silent and Ichigo could feel the weight of the promise he had made, feel how he was letting Chad down, but he understood. Yuri was quiet for a long moment before he adjusted his glasses in one sharp movement and added, "I suppose we could expect little else from you, Kurosaki." "You were all fine though?" Ichigo asked, staring at them and searching for visible wounds, but finding nothing. It helped Ichigo's conscience. Yuri nodded, but there was something to his expression that suggested more, a story that he wasn't quite ready to tell as he responded, "Yes, we completed our missions and returned to the training area until Yoruichi came to meet us and informed us of what happened." He nodded and listened to the quiet hum of Zangetsu's presence at the back of his mind as he stared at his friends. They all looked a bit older in some indescribable way, as if Soul Society had changed them all. It probably had. "After you collapsed, according to Yoruichi, the Sutaisho pardoned the rest of us of the supposed crime of assassinating Aizen and instead let Yoruichi tell him our true mission, which was to save Rukia. We were pardoned and have been granted access to Soul Society until we can return to the mortal world," Yuri informed with a bored tone, already reading Ichigo's mind and the questions at the front of it. Ichigo nodded, and part of him questioned why the Sutaisho was being lenient when he had heard enough about Soul Society's mercy, but the rest of him was just grateful. "Hey, Kurosaki?" Yuri said quietly as Orihime and Tatsuki traded words quietly and Chad rested with his eyes closed. Ichigo tilted his head and looked at his cousin, at the way they looked so different, at the twist of emotions hiding behind his eyes telling a story that couldn't be spoken aloud yet, and nodded. "Don't do that again." "I won't." Another knock on the door broke the weird, almost tender moment, and Ichigo almost wished Uno Hanataisho hadn't permitted visitors. He still felt sore and tired beyond that. Like he could sink right through the gurney and into the floor. The door slid open and Ichigo's chest followed through on the previous course of action and dropped out of his chest because there was Rukia with a tentative smile, who was alive and standing tall. She entered the room quietly, and before Ichigo could say anything, still floundering that she was there, alive and safe, Tatsuki stood up, an iron grip on Oriheim's wrist, and announced, "I forget, Yoruichi wanted us to meet her right now. We'll be back later, Ichigo." Before Ichigo could protest or even respond, Tatsuki was pulling Oriheim out the door with Chad and Yuri following behind. Rukia laughed, quiet and bubbly, as she padded over and plopped onto the end of the gurney, staring at the closed door with an amused smile as she commented, "They're not very subtle, huh?" "Nope." Ichigo responded with a grin, and then the tentative smile was there once more, thick with unsaid words between them. Ichigo peered at Rukia and blinked once at the blurry image of Sode no Shirayuki before the spirit solidified, pale and almost blending into the walls. She smiled kindly at Ichigo with warm eyes. "Ichigo," Rukia began, and hesitated as Ichigo's eyes landed on hers, and he waited, unsure of what to say that hadn't already been said at the execution stand. She continued, "I thank you for rescuing me, Ichigo. Even if it was an incredibly stupid thing to do, thank you. I made a promise, Rukia, I don't break my promises. And there was no way in hell I was going to let them execute you." Ichigo responded, staring into the almost lilac but more sky blue of Rukia's eyes as her expression twitched from a frown to something softer, familiar even from nights curled together on the couch criticizing CRP TV, or as she watched him help Yuzu cook, or as they all ate lunch on the rooftop. "I'm glad you're okay," she said quietly, like the words couldn't be spoken too loudly. Ichigo smiled and responded, "Me too, I'm glad we're okay." Ichigo waited in silence outside of the large wooden doors in the long hallway outside of the Sutaisho's office. It was quiet, the kind of oppressive quiet one might find in a library or a church, and only distantly could he hear the sound of footsteps and the general hum of a city at work. It was a sort of nerve-wracking, inducing silence. Ichigo had received the request to meet with the Sutaisho and had been led here by the lieutenant before he too disappeared. He felt, more so than ever, as if he was in a strange place with haphazard directions that left much to be desired. Was he supposed to go in himself? Was he supposed to wait outside? Was he even at the right room? It swirled inside Ichigo, a little pit of anxiety lodged in the back of his throat as he stared at the carved wood grains in front of him. They were lovely carvings too. Ichigo's head slid from side to side as his fingers idly toyed with the frayed edge of the shihakusho he had been given to wear. It was loose in the chest and a bit too long in the leg, but it fit well enough. He almost desperately wished for a Shinigami to pass by and ask if he needed assistance, because Ichigo wasn't ashamed to admit that he was terrified of the idea of just walking into the Sutaisho's office or of waiting endlessly. The doors in front of Ichigo creaked and with a lumbering motion began to swing slowly open. Ichigo stared for a long moment before he hastily stepped back and waited for the doors to finish opening, staring behind the thick wood at the office beyond. As the doors finished opening with a resounding clang, the kind one might presume to spell out one's final hour, Ichigo entered the Sutaisho's office. It was a large, airy room, but thick with age. Polished wood in warm tones made up most of the furniture, heavy curtains draped on either side of the many windows, bookshelves with an assortment of tomes piled alongside the walls with the odd trophy or token stuck on the shelves. The room had a timeless feel, like something out of a museum, all preserved in gold with dust motes floating dazedly through the air. Ichigo's eye swept around the large room as he paused in front of the doors before his gaze dropped to one end of the room where a large desk filled the space, bombarded by towers of paperwork that appeared to happily resist the laws of gravity. Behind the desk, Ichigo could see the Sutaisho. It was strange, Ichigo had heard so much about the man, from Kisuke, the wizard, Yoruichi, even Ashido had something to say about this man who had led the Gotei 13 for centuries. There was a sense of legend and myth about the man, like one might find about a hero from history, and yet this man had lived for centuries and was still alive. It was a strange idea to grasp when compared with the normal human lifespan. The steady scratch of the Sutaisho filling out paperwork filled the silence for a long moment as Ichigo stood unsure with his hands clasped behind his back. He still had no idea as to why the Sutaisho wished to meet with him. He could probably think of 100 minutely plausible reasons, but it did little to ease the tight knot his chest had worked itself into. The sound of papers shuffling halted, and the Sutaisho glanced up from his desk to stare at Ichigo. "Come take a seat, Kurosaki-san," the Sutaisho stated in a voice like the scrape of rock against one another. It was one used to commanding, and Ichigo hastily motioned a half bow and walked across the large room towards the chair the Sutaisho had indicated. His feet echoed on the floor, and if he looked down, he could almost see his reflection in the pale stone that made up the floor. It was a strange reflection, almost a stranger's, with the dark bags under his eyes, the bandages peeking out from under his collar, and the mess of his hair. He looked older. Ichigo settled in the seat, which was for the most part uncomfortable but was tolerable, and waited. Seated in front of the Sutaisho's desk, Ichigo could see the towering mass of papers tilt haphazardly in one direction before stilling once more. It was hardly surprising how much paperwork was generated by a military organization. Up close, the Sutaisho was as intimidating as from a distance. The man had thick brows, much like a caterpillar, a long beard, and heavyset eyes that radiated an intense heat all on their own. He waited in silence as the Sutaisho filled out sheets of paperwork, staring at the odd trinkets on the man's desk as a way to soothe the unease running rampant through his senses, even as he logically knew he was safe. Maybe safe wasn't the best word. Instead, he listened to the babble of Zangetsu's words as he complained about not getting to fight Aizen properly and to show him their Shikai. Ichigo knew that tactically it was probably for the best the man hadn't seen Ichigo's Shikai. Ichigo blinked and watched as a pale, almost translucent shadow flickered into existence behind the Sutaisho. It was tall like a giant with nebulas for eyes and plates of armor as fire coalesced across the spirit's body. The spirit was faint, but its presence alone was heavy as it stared across the desk at Ichigo. "You and your friends have done Soul Society a great service in aiding in the reveal of the traitors." The Sutaisho began, continuing to fill out a sheet with a blank expression that bordered on irritation, which Ichigo knew whole-heartedly was rather forcefully centered on the paperwork. Ichigo startled slightly at the old man's voice before he rolled his shoulders back and responded, "We really just wanted to save Rukia. I made a promise I would protect her." The old man's eyes flickered up from his paperwork to stare at Ichigo with a pensive expression, and Ichigo could almost picture the man stroking his long beard. Instead, the Sutaisho set down his pen and steepled his fingers in front of him on the desk. "Regardless, it was an honorable mission, and you have done Soul Society a great service. Because of this, the damage caused by your infiltration of the Gotei 13 will be largely forgotten. Indeed, it will serve as a future reference for our safety procedures and security." "Thank you," Ichigo replied demurely, a part of him honestly thankful. The Sutaisho could have chosen a far less lenient option, but the rest of him still stuck on the fact that he was in the Sutaisho's office. The old man nodded, and before he could speak again, a small side door slid open with a click and the lieutenant, Cheer something, entered carrying a tray with a teapot and mugs. The man set the tray down and bowed once to the Sutaisho before departing quietly. With a practiced ease, the Sutaisho poured the tea into the 2 cups, perfuming the air with the scent of jasmine and spirals of steam. Ichigo took the proffered cup and, with a careful breath to cool the liquid, took a sip. The tea curled warmth throughout his chest, helping to ease the tension that had bunched itself there as he bowed his head in thanks and waited for the Sutaisho to continue, knowing somehow that the meeting was far from finished. The Sutaisho set his own cup down after a long moment and turned to stare through a nearby window. Through the glass, Ichigo could see the broad expanse of Soul Society stretching out before him. "I have led the Gotei 13 for many years, more than a millennium," the Sutaisho stated, and the words were heavy with an exhaustion that seemed timeless in of itself. Ichigo supposed retirement wasn't really an option. The Sutaisho sighed softly, barely audible, and the man's spirit tilted their head to stare in concern at their wielder. "Soul Society will need to change," the old man stated, and took a slow sip of his tea. Ichigo mimicked the motion and wondered what the old man meant. It was true that Soul Society needed to change, but Ichigo wondered if it was the change he was thinking of and not just change to prepare for war. The Sutaisho's eyes fell away from the window and the early morning sky to stare at Ichigo as he stated, "We have lost 3 captains and will need to replace them." Ichigo's eyes widened because that was obvious, but he was unsure if the Sutaisho was suggesting what Ichigo really hoped he wasn't suggesting. A grin crinkled the corners of the old man's eyes, highlighting previously invisible laugh lines as the man added, "I was not suggesting you for captaincy, Kurosaki-san, do not worry. I was merely searching for your opinion on the matter." Ichigo grinned shakily and nodded, exhaling in relief as he dismissed the thought of how to tell the Sutaisho he was still in high school and how he was honored truly. Instead, Ichigo considered the Sutaisho's request. There was the possibility of promoting current lieutenants to the position, but likely most of them were not ready or would not fit the division needing a captain. It would almost be like the visit all over again. The Sutaisho could also outsource and look for past candidates who were no longer involved with the Gotei 13. Ichigo supposed he could mention the visit as well. "As I understand, you have 3 choices. Promoting lieutenants, outsourcing to former candidates or members of the Gotei 13, or reinstating the captains who were exiled a century ago." "The ones who were hollow-fied?" The Sutaisho questioned with a raised brow, his eyes dark and brimming with a warning all of its own that Ichigo should tread carefully. Ichigo nodded and with a careful breath and Osen's reassurance replied, "Yes, they were not hollow-fied by Kisuke Urahara as the Central 46 was led to believe, but by Aizen, who was conducting experiments." "Is there proof? And explain, if you will, how hollowification has affected the former members of the Gotei 13. Ichigo raised a brow at the question and carefully considered how to phrase his response in a manner that would be respectful of the visit and not reveal anything that should be kept secret. Zangetsu's suggestion rang loud in his ear and Ichigo easily ignored it in favor of replying, "Yes. The hollowification has allowed them to manifest hollow powers such as Sero and Sonido while also increasing overall power. And you know this because you have interacted with them in the living world?" "Yes, and with all due respect, sir, the captains who were hollowified are in complete control of their powers and would be a valuable asset to Soul Society if reinstated. However, a formal apology would likely be required for them to consider the offer." The Sutaisho stared at Ichigo for a long moment over steepled hands before he leaned back in his chair and rubbed a hand over his forehead. He looked his age suddenly. The old man took a drink of tea as a heavy silence lingered in the office. It wasn't foreboding, but rather more of the thoughtful type. "You were trained by Urahara, weren't you, Kurosaki-san?" "Yes." "You talk like the man and raise a very convincing argument. Tell me, you are young and distant from Soul Society. If you were to suggest changes to Soul Society, what would they be?" Ichigo's eyes widened at the question. It suddenly felt like a sort of Spanish Inquisition or an interview, because Ichigo was young and he hadn't expected the Sutaisho to ask him about what changes he thought Soul Society needed to make. The whole point was that Ichigo was young and adults too often refused to even consider what young people had to say. Then there was the matter of trying to compile suggestions for how to improve Soul Society. There was a lot. They were all necessary in the face of the coming war Aizen would surely institute. "I think the hierarchy of the Gotei 13 needs to change. Having only one lieutenant puts too much pressure on the lieutenant and limit opportunities for growth within the division. I understand there are seated positions, but adding another lieutenant will aid in the power balance. I think hiring secretaries, people who are specially trained in filling out paperwork and handling scheduling and other business stuff would be a good idea. It would take some of the weight off of the captains. I know some of the divisions have specializations, but if more could focus on specializations such as long distance, Kido, or even elemental Zanpakuto, that way divisions could be better divided based on priority in battle. Fortification and increased patrols for Rungakai would probably aid in recruitment and a general improvement of communication between the citizens and the Gotei 13. Technology will only be an aid, perhaps not from Kurosaki, but even investing in concepts the mortal world has progressed in such as transit, medical, food distribution, communication would help. Aizen knows Soul Society is stagnant. If you can prove you're not, you may gain the upper hand. Ichigo finished glancing at his hands. He felt certain that his suggestions would help improve Soul Society, but not certain the Sutaisho would be willing to accept them. Cautiously, Ichigo glanced up at the Sutaisho, who was staring out of the window with a pensive expression. "I am old, it is almost time for the new guard to rule. Perhaps after Aizen, I will retire," the Sutaisho said, and the words were quiet, more for the old man than for Ichigo to hear. He turned to face Ichigo and with dark eyes and a hint of a smile behind his frown stated, "Thank you for your input and time, Kurosaki-san. I have little doubt that in the coming war we will be on the same field once more." Ichigo nodded and tried to hide how the thought of war terrified him, and the thought that the Sutaisho was right was even more terrifying. Ichigo knew that as long as Aizen and his war existed that his friends and family wouldn't be safe. That Ichigo had been inducted into the war before he had a choice. "Thank you." Ichigo replied quietly and the Sutaisho nodded in return, a clear dismissal that the meeting was over. Ichigo carefully slipped out of the chair and walked silently across the stone floor towards the door. Part of him was doubtful that their meeting would make a change, but the rest of him was hopeful. Soul Society needed to change because Aizen would take ruthless advantage of stagnation, and if Soul Society were to fall, so too would the mortal world. Ichigo's head whipped around as he darted through the streets in a burst of Shiampa that would probably make Unohana angry that he was disobeying her instructions, no strenuous activity for a week or so. But Ichigo couldn't muster the extra fear for Unohana's future wrath as he skidded past a side street and glanced over his shoulder. In the distance, he could hear the tinkle of bells and the coarse laughter of a certain relentless captain. It wasn't fair. Ichigo was finally free from the fourth, and yet Kenpachi was also free, and apparently out for BLD. Ichigo questioned his life and darted down another side street, fervently praying that the 11th Division captain wouldn't follow him. Ichigo was at least partially thankful he had received a warning from the lieutenant, the little girl with pink hair who had appeared outside of the 1st Division with a wide bubbly smile and an announcement that Tsuken-chan wanted to play. And by play, she meant brutally attempt to murder Ichigo and then leave his corpse out to dry. It wasn't fair. Ichigo fought the captain once, healed him, and then the man attempts to track him down and fight him again. Karma had nothing to do with the fairness of that situation. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind the alleyway Ichigo was darting through, the walls passing in a blur of dingy white, and Ichigo cursed under his breath and pushed a bit harder even if his legs complained at the motion. Laughter rang out, loud and jarring behind Ichigo, and his heart skipped a beat in his chest as he cut blindly through the streets and into the main street where a few Shinigami were casually strolling but quickly scattered at the impending force of the 11th Division captain. Ichigo's eye swept near blindly from side to side, searching for somewhere to hide where the captain wouldn't be able to find him. There was a bar, already bustling loud in the early afternoon, which wasn't an option, a restaurant which Ichigo wanted to enter solely for the purpose of food but couldn't muster the will to disturb the other patrons. Moving swiftly over the paved stones, Ichigo darted down another street and spotted the doors to one of the divisions. He didn't particularly care which, only that it wasn't the 11th, and darted inside, closing the door with a careful click. He leaned against the wall beside the door and waited with bated breath, his hands clenched into fists at his side as he tried to squish down the terror bundling itself into his chest. It was honestly a bit horrifying. Even if Ichigo knew he could fight the captain and win, there was something about being so relentlessly chased that felt like a horror movie, like the end result couldn't be anything but bad and maybe a bit gory. The sound of the captain's heavy footsteps plodded past the door, and Ichigo heard the heavy rustle of the man's sword as he paused outside the 6th Division. Ichigo held his breath and drew in his Reiatsu as close as possible to his body, waiting as his hand drifted closer to Zangetsu's hilt. "He's pretty good at playing hide and seek, her Ken-chan?" The lieutenant, Yachiru, stated, and Ichigo could picture her sitting on the captain's shoulder staring about with a confused expression. Kenpachi laughed, the rough sound like the tearing of paper, and his footsteps picked up again as he replied to his lieutenant, "I'll find him eventually though," and left. All the air trapped in Ichigo's lungs escaped in a rush as he slumped against the wall and focused on the intense, and somewhat temporary, relief that the captain hadn't found him. "Kurosaki!" A voice like the glacier of the Ice Age itself called out, sharp and short like the words were pulled unwilling from the recipient's vocal cords. Ichigo paused and opened his eyes, straightening slightly as he was greeted with the icy grey eyes of the captain of the 6th Division, Rukia's brother. Ichigo mimicked a quick bow that failed to hide the new shake in his hands as he wondered if this captain would attempt to kill him, and with a small frown stated, "I'm sorry for intruding, Kuchiki Taisho. Kenpachi Taisho was chasing me." Kuchiki Taisho's face twitched ever so slightly, and Ichigo knew without a doubt that the man was laughing at his misfortune. Instead, Kuchiki Taisho nodded once and a silence that was thick and heavy with one-sided awkwardness filled the entryway. Ichigo almost prayed that someone would try to enter the division if only to end the silence. "Thank you for your effort to save Rukia," Kuchiki-san said quietly and with an utterly blank expression that failed to hide the stiff front of the words. Ichigo knew the man was likely only saying them because his honor dictated it or something, but Ichigo couldn't find the measure to care. Not yet. Maybe once the captain showed he did genuinely care for Rukia beyond being a blank canvas would Ichigo care. He knew Kuchiki Taisho had attempted to save Rukia from Aizen and Ichigo was happy about that, but it wasn't enough. "I made a promise," Ichigo replied with a short bow and as little emotion as he could possibly muster, trying to hint at about 5 different things, but namely how Ichigo didn't do it for Kuchiki Taisho. The captain's Zanpakuto spirit drifted into existence and bowed once, deep and from the waist to Ichigo, and through the mask, Ichigo received a general sense of thanks far more heartfelt than anything the captain could muster. The spirit disappeared and Kuchiki Taisho stared at Ichigo for one long moment before with a dismissing nod he turned and drifted down the hallway, the long fall of his black hair and the ornamentation in his hair catching the golden light of the sun shining through the windows. "Still a DJ. Ichigo!" A familiar voice called out and Ichigo turned with a half-smile already on his lips as he spotted Renji walking down the hallway. His spirit padded beside him, and he had a smile on his features even with the obvious bags beneath his eyes. Ichigo mimed a small wave at his friend and waited until Renji was close to properly grin at him. Before Ichigo could say anything, Renji wrapped his arms around Ichigo in a tight hug. Ichigo blinked in surprise and stiffened for a moment before he hesitantly wrapped his arms around Renji, revealing in the warmth of his friend and the comforting feeling of the hug. Renji pulled back a moment later and his smile was soft and his eyes were crinkled at the corners as he said, "Thanks Ichigo, honestly, you really saved Rukia." He grinned back and promptly replied, "I couldn't have done it without your help." Renji's grin brightened and his Zanpakuto spirit curled their snake tail around Ichigo's leg in a fond motion. Renji slipped an arm around Ichigo's shoulder and gently tugged him down the hallway as he stated, "I know. You kept your promise. Come on, you can see the training yard for the 6th. Are you sure? What about Kuchiki Taisho? I don't want to overstay my welcome." Ichigo responded, letting Renji tug him down the hallway as he glanced at the offices and barracks they passed. It was a lot neater than the 13th Division. Renji shook his head, the movement throwing the red spikes of his hair around, as he grinned a Hollywood grin and replied, "Nah, don't worry about it. Kuchiki Taisho kind of feels like he owes you a life debt now, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. Just don't tell him I said that and don't cause mass destruction and you'll be good." He nodded, not really sure if he actually believed Renji, but was happy enough to follow along. Renji paused outside one door, and unslinging his arm from around Ichigo's shoulder, he slid the door open. It opened onto a shaded veranda and a dusty yard where a few Shinigami milled about with training Zanpakuto, and the sun turned everything hazy and gold like a distant memory. Renji pulled Ichigo outside and casually leaned against a wall as he announced, "This is where we do a lot of the training, I oversee most of it usually." Ichigo nodded. He could picture Renji standing in front of a group of Shinigami watching them repeat a similar motion over and over again, or presiding over spars. It was kind of weird to picture that Renji was a lieutenant because he was so down-to-earth and easy to relate to. Ichigo hadn't really had the chance to meet the other lieutenants and captains yet, but Rukia had promised to introduce him with a glint in her eye that meant refusal wasn't really an option. He glanced over at Renji, who was staring at Ichigo with bright eyes and casually running his fingers over the pommel of his Zanpakuto as he stated, "You know, when Unohana releases you from bed rest we should spar, test out our Shikai. And you can't act like you don't have one, I saw yours." Ichigo thought about it. Part of him was tired of fighting, he liked the adrenaline, liked the feel of pitting yourself against a competitor who was stronger and seeing how far you could go, how many limits you could push. But the threat of death hanging over your head kind of dimmed that excitement. Also, he wasn't quite sure when Renji had seen his Shikai unless it had been when they were training. "Yeah, that would be nice. What's this I hear about a spar?" A familiar voice asked, and maybe Ichigo knew too many familiar voices, as the door slid open and 2 Shinigami stepped onto the veranda. It was the two Shinigami he had fought when they first invaded the Gotei 13, Ikaku and Yumichika, right? Osen hummed an affirmation far better at names than Ichigo. Renji grinned, toothy like a shark, at Ikaku and stated casually, I was just speaking about sparring with Ichigo here, but the 11th isn't invited. Funny because our captain is looking for the infamous Kurosaki-san. Yumichika replied with a smile like broken glass as he adjusted the fall of his Shihakusho. Ichigo blanched and resolutely looked in the opposite direction and searched with his Reiatsu for the errant captain of the 11th, who was thankfully still errant. Now I've already claimed him. Yeah, but you were a member of the 11th first, so technically you claimed him for us. Ikaku replied with a devilish grin as his hand rested on the hilt of his Zanpakuto in challenge. Ichigo blinked, suddenly turned into the conversation and with a roll of his eyes stated, no one's claiming anyone. And you were a member of the 11th, Renji? Yeah, a while ago before I transferred to the 6th. It explains a lot. Ichigo replied bluntly and watched with amusement as Renji squawked and turned to Ichigo with a hurt expression. Yumichika nodded his head sagely and Ikaku grinned and turned to face Ichigo with a frown as he said, that fight was totally cheap by the way and I demand a rematch. The words were said jokingly, but Ichigo could hear something sharp and serious behind them, something related to honor or the like. So, he nodded and grinned bright and determined even as inside he wondered why he was signing himself up for spars right and left. And you have to use your Shokai, dual blades are quite rare. Yumichika added pleasantly to the fervent nods of both Renji and Ikaku. Ichigo blinked at the two of them and tilted his head as he asked, really? Yeah, only Yukitake Taisho, Kiraraku Taisho, and Lieutenant Hisagi have dual-bladed Zanpakuto. Renji replied in what Ichigo was beginning to call his teacher voice. It was an interesting fact, Ichigo had never considered the possibility that his dual blade was unique, it just made sense for how his powers worked. But it was true that no one else in the mortal world had dual blades. Ichigo shrugged and Ikaku shared a look with Renji and Yumichika that managed to convey a sense of nostalgic reminiscence of their own youth. Ichigo felt almost excluded, he wasn't part of this society as much as he could blend in, but it didn't really bother him. Renji turned to look at Ichigo and his eyes softened, with a grin he slung his arm over his shoulder and stated, we'll save that spar for another day, Ichigo is still on ordered bedrest from Unohana Taisho. They all took a moment to shudder and Renji continued, but for now I'm going to steer him back to the 4th. We'll keep Kenpachi Taisho distracted for a little bit. Yumichika replied with a smile, a tilt of his head, and a jostle of Ikaku's arm. The bald Shinigami nodded even though he was pouting and staring at Ichigo with an almost pleading expression. Find someone else to spar with please, Ichigo silently begged. We good? Ichigo said instead with a smile that Oriheim had once described as charming and Tatsuki had grudgingly agreed was. Yumichika nodded and Ikaku grinned as he replied, as long as we have that spar, sure. He grinned and let Renji drag him towards the door and inside the cool hallway, pausing only to hear Yumichika call out, make sure to keep Kurosaki-kun out of Kurosucha Taisho's hands. I will. Renji called back with a serious expression, Ichigo wasn't going to question it. Renji glanced down and must have noticed Ichigo's concerned expression as he smiled, warm and friendly, and said, come on, let's get you back to your friends before Rukia can nag me for potentially endangering your life. She likes to do that, huh? Yes. Renji replied shortly and Ichigo muffled a laugh as they exited the 6th division and stepped into the bright sunlight of the street. Maybe Soul Society was far different from the mortal world, behind in technology and a whole slew of things, but on the basic level, the Shinigami were still people. Ichigo was okay with the idea of fighting beside them, but maybe not the idea of the future fight.